Hermione could have stayed in the safety of her third year, where the worst thing facing her was Professor Snape's increasingly impossible potions essays and the weight of too many classes pressing against her shoulders like stones. It would have been so easy to hand the time-turner back to Professor McGonagall and pretend the temptation had never existed, whispering in the back of her mind during every ancient runes lecture, every arithmancy problem set, every moment when her fingers found the small hourglass beneath her robes. But the knowledge burned too fierce and bright to ignore. She stood now in the shadowed alcove behind the pillar at King's Cross Station, her bushy brown hair tucked beneath a knitted cap that belonged to some other decade, some other version of herself that had never read about the boy who lived in a cupboard. The time-turner's chain felt heavier around her neck than it ever had in Professor McGonagall's office, weighted with the responsibility of 5 precious hours. 5 hours to change everything, or at least to understand why everything had gone so terribly wrong from the very beginning. The station hummed with the particular energy of London in 1987, all sharp shoulder pads and cigarette smoke, and newspapers folded precisely in half. She had studied the year obsessively before making the jump. Muggle newspapers archived in the library, fashion magazines that Parvati had giggled over, anything that might help her blend into a time that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. But none of her research had prepared her for how young everything would look, how impossibly young, as though the world itself had been pulled backward into some earlier version of itself. A child's voice cut through the morning bustle, high and thin with poorly concealed panic. "Excuse me, sir, I'm looking for platform. I'm trying to find. My train's supposed to leave at 11, but I can't find." Hermione turned toward the sound, and her breath caught in her throat like a trapped bird. The boy speaking to the harried businessman could not have been older than 7, standing barely as tall as the man's elbow, with a shock of dark hair that stuck up at angles that defied any attempt at order. He clutched a crumpled piece of paper in one small fist, and even from her hiding spot 20 feet away, Hermione could see the way his other hand shook as he tugged at the sleeve of a coat that hung loose on his thin frame. Harry Potter. 6 years before Hogwarts. 6 years before Hagrid would arrive with cake and gentle explanations and the key to a world that made sense. This was Harry Potter as no one had ever described him to her. Small and lost and achingly, impossibly young. "Can't help you, son." The businessman's voice carried the particular brand of London impatience reserved for anyone who dared to interrupt the serious business of getting to work. "Try the information desk." The man brushed past without a second glance, leaving Harry standing alone in the middle of the concourse with his shoulders hunched inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller. Hermione watched him look around with the careful desperation of someone who had learned early that asking for help often led to disappointment, that being noticed was frequently worse than being ignored. Her feet moved without conscious decision, carrying her across the polished floor toward the boy who would someday be her best friend and was currently nothing more than a frightened child with nowhere to go. "Are you lost?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle and pitched low enough not to startle him. Harry's head jerked up, and Hermione had to bite back a gasp at the sight of his face. She had known, intellectually, that his childhood with the Dursleys had been difficult. Harry himself had mentioned it in passing, always with a dismissive shrug that suggested the topic was closed to discussion. Ron had muttered darkly about locked doors and missed meals when he thought Harry couldn't hear. But knowing and seeing were entirely different creatures, and the boy in front of her looked like he had been carved from hunger itself. His cheeks were hollow, in a way that spoke of too many days with not enough food. His green eyes, and they were green, shockingly so, the color of new grass after spring rain, sat in dark circles that made him look like a child playing at being a ghost. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead was barely visible beneath the dark fringe of his hair, just a thin line that might have been a shadow if she hadn't known to look for it. Yes, a bit, Harry admitted, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who had learned to apologize for existing. I'm supposed to catch a train at 11, but I can't find the platform. It says platform 9 3/4, but that doesn't make any sense, does it? Platform 9 3/4. The words hit Hermione like a physical blow, and she had to fight to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced through possibilities. How could Harry know about the Hogwarts Express? How could he possibly have a ticket to platform 9 3/4 when he was 7 years old and living with muggles who thought magic was something to be feared and suppressed? 9 3/4, she repeated carefully, buying herself time to think. That is unusual. May I see your ticket? Harry hesitated for a moment, then held out the crumpled paper. Hermione took it, with fingers that trembled slightly, and her breath caught as she smoothed out the creases. It was definitely a Hogwarts Express ticket, printed on the familiar thick parchment stock with the distinctive burgundy ink. But instead of the September 1st departure, she knew by heart this ticket was dated for a random Tuesday in October, 1987. Instead of listing a student name in the elegant script reserved for Hogwarts correspondence, it simply read, Platform 9 3/4, complimentary journey, departure 11 a.m. Where did you get this? She asked, looking up to find Harry watching her with the wary attention of someone who had learned to read adult expressions for signs of trouble. It came in the post yesterday morning, Harry said, tucking his hands into the pockets of his oversized coat. There was a letter with it, but Uncle Vernon burned it before I could read it properly. He was very angry about the whole thing. Said it was some sort of prank, and that I was to get rid of it immediately and never mention it again. But you kept it anyway. A flush crept up Harry's neck. I know I shouldn't have, but it was addressed to me, to Harry Potter, not just boy or you. It had my name written on the envelope in proper ink, like I was someone important enough to send letters to. He looked down at his shoes, which Hermione could now see were several sizes too large and held together with tape. I've never gotten a letter before. Not a real one, anyway. The simple honesty of it made Hermione's throat tight. She knelt down so that she was at Harry's eye level, studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for particularly difficult transfiguration homework. Harry, she said slowly, what do you know about magic? The question hung in the air between them like a soap bubble, fragile and shimmering with possibility. Harry's eyes widened, and for a moment his carefully constructed politeness slipped to reveal something raw and hungry underneath. Magic isn't real, he said automatically, but the words carried no conviction. Uncle Vernon says it's all nonsense and lies, and that anyone who believes in such things is either mad or deliberately making trouble. But you don't believe that, Hermione observed. It wasn't a question. Harry's small hands clenched into fists. Sometimes things happen around me. Strange things. Things that Uncle Vernon gets very angry about, even though I don't mean for them to happen. He met her eyes with the particular courage of someone who had decided that the truth was worth whatever punishment might follow. Are you from the place that sent the ticket? In a way, Hermione said carefully. She glanced around the station, noting the steady stream of people flowing past them without a second glance. Would you like me to show you where platform 9 3/4 is? The transformation in Harry's face was immediate and heartbreaking. The careful wariness melted away, replaced by an expression of such desperate hope that Hermione had to swallow hard against the sudden ache in her chest. You know where it is? Really? Really. She stood up and held out her hand, noting the way Harry hesitated for just a moment before taking it. His fingers were thin and cold, but his grip was strong. "Come with me." They walked together through the station, past the ordinary platforms with their ordinary trains, until they reached the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Hermione stopped and turned to face Harry, who was looking around with the confused expression of someone who had expected something more obviously magical than a solid brick wall. "Now," she said, keeping her voice low, "this might seem frightening at first, but I promise you're perfectly safe. We're going to run straight at that wall, and when we get there, it's going to let us through to the other side." Harry looked at her with the patient expression of someone humoring a lunatic. "The wall is going to let us through. I know it sounds impossible, but magic often does, doesn't it? Until you see it for yourself." Hermione squeezed his hand gently. "Do you trust me?" The question seemed to surprise Harry. He tilted his head to one side, studying her face with the same intensity she had used on him moments before. "I don't know you," he said finally. "I don't even know your name. But you're the first person who's ever talked to me about magic like it might be real. And you're the first person who's ever offered to help me get somewhere I wanted to go." He straightened his shoulders with unconscious dignity. "Yes, I trust you." Hermione felt something crack open in her chest, something warm and fierce and protective. "My name is Hermione," she said, "and I'm going to take very good care of you. Now, on the count of 3. 1. They ran together toward the barrier, Harry's hand clutched tightly in hers, and Hermione watched his face transform from terror to amazement as the solid wall melted away around them like morning mist. Platform 9 3/4 spread out before them in all its impossible glory. The scarlet steam engine, the crowds of witches and wizards in robes and pointed hats, the owls hooting from their cages, and the cats weaving between legs, and the general air of barely contained magic that hung over everything like perfume. Harry stopped dead in the middle of the platform, his mouth falling open in an expression of such pure wonder that Hermione felt her heart twist with something that might have been grief or might have been joy. "It's real," he whispered. "It's all real." "Yes," Hermione said softly. "It's all real. And you belong here, Harry Potter, more than you know." They found an empty compartment on the train, and Harry pressed his face against the window like a child half his age, watching the London countryside roll past as they travelled toward a destination that existed only in the space between one moment and the next. Hermione sat across from him and tried to memorize everything. The way his eyes reflected the changing landscape, the careful way he touched each surface in the compartment, as though testing its solidity, the questions that tumbled out of him in an endless stream of curiosity. Where are we going? Who are all these people? Why do they dress like that? Is it always like this? Or is today special? Are you a witch? You must be a witch. You knew about the barrier. Are there schools for magic? Is that where this train is taking us? Do I get to stay? The last question broke her heart all over again, because underneath the excitement was the bone-deep expectation of disappointment that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. "We're going to a very special place," she told him, choosing her words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. "A place where people like us can learn about magic and be safe while we're doing it." "But Harry..." She paused, hating what she was about to say. "This is just a visit, a very short visit. You can't stay. Not yet." The light dimmed in Harry's eyes, but he nodded with the resignation of someone who had learned not to expect good things to last. "I understand," he said, quietly. "Things like this don't happen to me. Not really. I should have known it was too good to be true." "No. The word came out sharper than she had intended, and Harry flinched. Hermione gentled her voice and leaned forward. It's not too good to be true. It's just not time yet. But it will be time, Harry. I promise you that. When you turn 11, you'll get another letter, and that time you'll be able to stay for as long as you want. 11? Harry's forehead wrinkled in thought. That's 4 more years. 4 more years, Hermione agreed. And I know that seems like forever when you're 7. But you're strong, Harry Potter. Stronger than you know. You can wait 4 more years. They talked until the train began to slow, and Hermione realized with a growing sense of panic that she was running out of time. The time-turner would only allow her 5 hours in the past, and she had already used most of them on this single, precious conversation. I have to go soon, she told Harry, as the train pulled into a station that flickered between existing and not existing, between real and imaginary. But I want you to remember something very important. You are not a burden. You are not unwanted. You are not a mistake. There are people who love you, even if you haven't met them yet. And someday very soon, you're going to have friends who would do anything to protect you. Harry's eyes filled with tears that he blinked away quickly, as though crying was another luxury he couldn't afford. Will I see you again? He asked. Hermione felt the time-turner's pull beginning to tug at the edges of her consciousness, pulling her forward through time like a fish on a line. Maybe, she said, and kissed his forehead where the scar lay hidden beneath his dark hair. But even if you don't, I'll always be watching out for you. I promise. The last thing she saw before the world dissolved around her was Harry Potter's face, 7 years old and full of hope despite everything, pressed against the train window as he waved goodbye to a girl whose name he would remember for the rest of his life. Hermione landed hard on the floor of the abandoned classroom where she had started this journey, her knees hitting the stone with a crack that she felt all the way up her spine. The time-turner lay warm and still against her chest, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but think about green eyes and the way a child's hand had felt in hers. She had 4 more hours until curfew, 4 hours to plan her return trip and figure out how to save a boy who was already lost. 4 hours to change everything. The second time Hermione turned the time-turner, she did it with the methodical precision of someone who had spent the intervening hours poring over every magical theory she could find about blood protection, ancient magic, and the delicate art of temporal intervention. 3 turns of the golden hourglass, each one deliberate and measured, and the familiar sensation of time reversing itself pulled her backward through the hours until she stood once again in 1987, with 5 precious hours stretching out before her like an uncharted map. This time she had a plan. She apparated, carefully, quietly, with the kind of focused concentration that Professor McGonagall had drilled into every third-year student, to the corner of Privet Drive, just as the autumn afternoon was beginning to settle into the particular shade of grey that marked suburban England in October. The street stretched out in front of her in perfect, suffocating symmetry. Identical houses with identical gardens and identical aspirations, all of them maintaining the precise level of normalcy that made magic seem not just impossible but actively offensive. Number 4 stood halfway down the row, as unremarkable as every other house on the street, except for the way it seemed to hum with barely perceptible tension, like a violin string wound too tight. Hermione crouched behind a parked Ford Cortina and settled in to wait, her heart beating a steady rhythm against her ribs as she watched the front door with the focused intensity of a cat stalking a particularly interesting mouse. She didn't have to wait long. The door opened with the sharp crack of someone who was not in the mood for gentleness, and Harry tumbled out onto the front step with the graceless stumble of someone who had been pushed rather than released. He picked himself up quickly, brushing dirt from his too large clothes with the automatic efficiency of long practice, and Hermione felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach as she watched him glance back at the closed door with an expression that mixed wariness, resignation, and something that might have been relief. He was smaller than she remembered from their meeting at the station, somehow diminished by the context of this place where he clearly didn't belong. The clothes that had seemed merely oversized yesterday now looked deliberate in their poor fit, as though someone had chosen them specifically to make him look ridiculous. His dark hair stuck up at familiar angles, but there was a defeated quality to his posture that made him seem younger than his 7 years. Harry walked down the front path with careful, measured steps, his eyes fixed on the pavement in front of him, as though looking up might invite unwanted attention. When he reached the gate, he paused and glanced back at the house one more time, and Hermione caught a glimpse of his face in profile. There was a fresh bruise along his jaw that hadn't been there the day before, a purple shadow that made her hands clench into fists without conscious thought. She followed him as he made his way through the neighborhood, keeping far enough back that he wouldn't notice her, but close enough that she could intervene if necessary. Harry walked with the aimless determination of someone who had been told to stay outside until dinner time and had learned not to question the logic of such commands. He avoided the main roads, sticking to side streets and empty lots where he was less likely to encounter other children or adults who might ask uncomfortable questions about why he was wandering around alone. After 20 minutes of watching Harry kick stones and examine interesting bits of rubbish with the intense focus of someone who had learned to find entertainment wherever it could be found, Hermione made her decision. She needed to see inside that house. She needed to understand exactly what was happening to him when no one was watching. The walk back to Privet Drive felt longer than it had any right to, weighted as it was with the growing certainty that she was not going to like what she discovered. The street was quiet in the way that suburban streets always were in the late afternoon, full of the hidden bustle of people making dinner and helping with homework and living the sort of ordinary lives that Harry Potter would never be allowed to have. Number 4. Privet Drive looked exactly the same as every other house on the street, which was precisely the problem. It was supposed to be a home, a place of safety and warmth and all the small kindnesses that children required to grow up straight and strong. Instead, it radiated the particular brand of cold disapproval that Hermione recognized from her own worst nightmares about being unwanted. She approached the front gate with the cautious steps of someone who had read extensively about magical protections but had never actually encountered them in the wild. The garden was pristine in the way that spoke of obsessive attention to detail, every blade of grass precisely the same length, every flower bed maintained with military precision. It was beautiful in the way that a museum display was beautiful, perfect, untouchable, and utterly devoid of the messy warmth that made a place feel like home. Hermione reached for the gate latch, and the world exploded into sensation. The magical backlash hit her like a physical blow, sending her stumbling backward onto the pavement with her ears ringing and her vision blurred at the edges. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except lie on the cold concrete and wait for her nervous system to remember how to function properly. When the worst of it had passed, she sat up carefully and stared at the house with new understanding. The blood protection magic wasn't subtle or gentle. It was a wall of pure magical force designed to keep threats away from Harry Potter by any means necessary. She could feel it now that she knew what to look for, pressing against her magical senses like a physical weight, ancient and implacable and utterly uncompromising in its purpose. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress, and Harry was trapped inside it. The realization settled over her like a lead blanket, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. She had read about blood protection in theory of ancient magic, had memorized the relevant passages in defensive magical theory, but she had never understood the full implications until this moment. The magic that protected Harry from Voldemort was the same magic that would prevent anyone from removing him from this place, no matter how desperately he might need rescuing. Dumbledore had known exactly what he was doing when he left Harry on this doorstep 6 years ago. Hermione picked herself up from the pavement and walked away from Privet Drive on unsteady legs, her mind racing through possibilities and discarding each one as quickly as it formed. Direct rescue was impossible. The blood protection would stop her just as effectively as it would stop any Death Eater. Involving the authorities was out of the question, both because they were muggles who wouldn't understand the magical complexities involved, and because any investigation that resulted in Harry being removed from his blood relatives would leave him vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack the protection was designed to prevent. She needed a different approach entirely. By the time she found Harry again, sitting alone on a swing in a small park 6 streets away from Privet Drive, she had formulated the beginnings of a plan. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't simple, but it was the only option that didn't involve abandoning a 7-year-old boy to circumstances that were clearly beyond his ability to handle. "Hello again," she said, settling onto the swing next to his with the careful casualness of someone who didn't want to startle a skittish animal. Harry looked up with the quick, guilty expression of someone who had been caught doing something wrong, even though sitting on a swing in a public park was hardly a criminal offense. "Oh," he said, and his face brightened with genuine pleasure. "It's you. Hermione, wasn't it? From the train station?" "That's right." Hermione studied his face in the fading afternoon light, noting the way he held himself carefully upright, despite the obvious fatigue in his small frame. "I was hoping I might see you again. How are you settling back in at home?" The question was gentle, pitched to sound like ordinary concern, but Harry's reaction told her everything she needed to know. His shoulders tensed, and his eyes darted away from hers with the automatic deflection of someone who had learned that honesty about certain subjects led to consequences. "It's fine," he said, with the flat affect of a child reciting a well-rehearsed script. "Everything's perfectly normal, just like it should be. And your family, are they—" Hermione paused, searching for words that would encourage honesty without putting Harry in the position of having to actively criticize the people he lived with. "Are they curious about your trip yesterday? About where you went?" Harry's laugh was short and bitter, far too adult an expression for someone who should still be losing teeth and believing in Father Christmas. "They don't ask about things like that," he said. "They don't like to know about the strange things that happen around me. It's easier for everyone if we just pretend they don't exist." "But they do exist," Hermione said carefully. "The strange things, I mean. They're real, and they're part of who you are, and there's nothing wrong with them." Harry turned to look at her fully for the first time since she had sat down, and she could see the desperate hope in his green eyes struggling against the bone-deep conviction that good things didn't happen to boys like him. "You really believe that, don't you?" he asked. "You're not just saying it to be kind." "I really believe it," Hermione said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Harry, the magic that you can do, it's not something to be afraid of or ashamed of. It's a gift, a wonderful, extraordinary gift that makes you special in the very best way." "My uncle says it makes me a freak," Harry said quietly, his voice barely audible over the creak of the swing chains. "He says that normal people don't make strange things happen, and that if I can't learn to stop it, then maybe I'm not normal enough to live with normal people." The words hit Hermione like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't speak past the fury that rose in her throat like bile. The idea that anyone could look at Harry Potter, brave, brilliant, wonderful Harry Potter, and see something broken that needed fixing was so fundamentally wrong that it made her want to march straight back to Privet Drive and give the Dursleys a piece of her mind, blood protection or no blood protection. But that wasn't what Harry needed from her right now. "Your uncle is wrong," she said instead, keeping her voice gentle, despite the anger burning in her chest. "Magic isn't something you should try to stop or hide or be ashamed of. It's part of who you are, just like having green eyes or being left-handed or liking chocolate ice cream. And there's absolutely nothing freakish about any of those things." Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful attention of someone who had been given very few positive things to think about himself and wanted to examine each one thoroughly before accepting it as truth. "Are there really schools for people like us?" he asked finally. "Schools where magic is normal and no one thinks you're strange for being able to do impossible things?" "There are," Hermione confirmed. "Wonderful schools where you can learn to control your magic and use it to help people and do amazing things that most people can only dream about. And when you're 11, you'll get to go to one of them." 11, Harry repeated, just as he had on the train. 4 more years. 4 more years, Hermione agreed. "But I promise you, Harry, they will be the most wonderful years of your life once you get there. You'll have friends who understand exactly what it's like to be different, and teachers who think magic is the most natural thing in the world, and a place where you can be yourself without having to apologize for it." Harry smiled then, small and tentative but genuine, and Hermione felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. "Will you tell me about it?" he asked. "About the school and the magic, and what it's like to be somewhere where being strange is normal?" Hermione glanced at the time turner beneath her robes, calculating how much time she had left before she would be pulled back to her own timeline. 2 hours, maybe 3 if she pushed it. Not nearly enough to answer all the questions that Harry deserved to have answered, but enough to give him something to hold on to during the long months ahead. "I'll tell you everything I can," she said, and settled back on the swing to begin weaving the story that would carry Harry Potter through the darkest parts of his childhood and into the light on the other side. As the sun set behind the suburban rooftops and the streetlights began to flicker on one by one, Hermione Granger sat in a playground in 1987 and told a 7-year-old boy about magic and friendship and the absolute certainty that his life was going to be extraordinary, even if he couldn't see it yet. She had found the problem. Now she just had to figure out how to solve it. The third time Hermione turned the time turner, she hesitated for a moment before making the final rotation, her fingers trembling against the delicate golden chain. Each trip back to 1987 felt like stepping further away from her own timeline and deeper into something that might be irrevocably changed by her presence. She could feel the weight of temporal magic pressing against her consciousness like a gathering storm, and with it came the uncomfortable awareness that she was no longer simply observing the past. She was actively reshaping it. But Harry's face in her memory, small and bruised and desperately hopeful, pushed aside her theoretical concerns about paradoxes and butterfly effects. Some things were more important than temporal stability. The familiar sensation of time reversing itself pulled her backward through the hours until she stood once again in October 1987, with the autumn afternoon settling around her like a well-worn coat. She had memorized Harry's routine by now. The reluctant exit from Privet Drive in the early afternoon, the careful avoidance of main streets and busy playgrounds, the eventual settlement in the small park 6 streets away, where he could sit on the swings and think without being bothered by anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about why he was alone. This time, she was waiting for him when he arrived. "You're here again," Harry said, as he approached the swing set, and there was something in his voice that might have been wonder if it hadn't been so carefully hidden behind practiced wariness. "I told you I might see you again," Hermione replied, gesturing to the empty swing beside her. "I was hoping we could talk some more about magic. If you'd like to, that is." Harry's face lit up with the kind of unguarded excitement that belonged to children who had been given very few things to be excited about. He scrambled onto the swing with the eager clumsiness of someone who was still growing into his own limbs, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was, a 7-year-old boy who had been offered the one thing he wanted most in the world. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. "About magic being normal and schools where people like us can learn about it. And I wanted to ask, if you don't mind, what's it like? Being able to do magic on purpose, instead of just having strange things happen when you're upset?" Hermione felt her heart constrict at the casual way he mentioned being upset, as though emotional distress was as much a part of his daily routine as brushing his teeth or eating breakfast. She forced herself to focus on the question itself, rather than the implications hidden beneath it. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. "When you can control your magic, it feels like having a new sense that you didn't know you were missing. You can make things move without touching them, or change the color of objects, or even make yourself invisible if you're very good at it." Harry's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. "Invisible? Really? Really?" Hermione smiled at his expression, remembering her own amazement when she had first learned about disillusionment charms. There are spells for almost anything you can imagine. Magic to heal injuries, magic to help plants grow, magic to make lights that never burn out, magic to send messages across great distances, magic to keep food fresh indefinitely, magic to... She caught herself before she could mention patronuses or defensive spells or any of the darker applications of magic that a 7-year-old boy shouldn't have to think about. Harry's childhood would be difficult enough without her adding premature nightmares about dementors and dark arts. "Magic to do good things," she finished instead. "Magic to help people and solve problems and make the world a little bit brighter." Harry was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the intense concentration of someone who had been given a glimpse of something too wonderful to fully believe. "The strange things that happen around me," he said finally, "when I get angry or scared or really upset about something. Is that magic too?" "Yes," Hermione said gently. "That's called accidental magic. It happens to all young witches and wizards when their emotions get very strong. It's completely normal, and it's actually a sign that you have quite a lot of magical power." Harry's face went through a complicated series of expressions. Relief, confusion, fear, and something that might have been cautious pride, all chasing each other across his features like clouds across a changeable sky. "But my family hates it," he said quietly. "When strange things happen, they get so angry. My uncle says it's unnatural and wrong, and that normal people don't do things like that. He says if I can't learn to control it, then maybe I don't deserve to live with normal people at all." The casual delivery of this devastating statement hit Hermione like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't speak past the rage that rose in her throat like fire. The idea that anyone could look at a 7-year-old child manifesting natural magical ability and respond with threats of abandonment was so fundamentally cruel that it made her want to march straight back to Privet Drive and hex the Dursleys into next week. "Harry," she said, when she could trust her voice to remain steady. Your uncle is completely wrong. What you can do isn't unnatural or bad or anything to be ashamed of. It's a gift, and the fact that your magic is strong enough to manifest without training just means you're going to be extraordinary when you learn to control it properly. Really? Harry's voice was small and hopeful and heartbreakingly uncertain. Really? Hermione said firmly. Would you like me to show you? Harry nodded so enthusiastically that his dark hair flopped into his eyes, and Hermione had to suppress a smile at his eagerness. She glanced around the empty park to make sure they weren't being observed, then pulled out her wand with the careful deliberation of someone performing magic for an audience that had never seen it done intentionally before. This is a wand, she explained, holding the slender piece of vine wood so that Harry could see it clearly. It helps focus magical energy so that spells come out the way you intend them to. When you're older and you go to school, you'll get one of your own. Harry stared at the wand with the kind of fascination usually reserved for priceless artifacts or creatures from fairy tales. Would it be all right if I touched it? He asked hesitantly. Hermione held out the wand, and Harry reached for it with trembling fingers, handling it as though it were made of spun glass and dreams. The moment his skin made contact with the wood, a shower of golden sparks erupted from the tip, swirling around them both like tiny stars before dissolving into the afternoon air. Harry jerked his hand back with a gasp, but his face was radiant with wonder. It liked me, he whispered. I could feel it. Like it was happy to meet me. Wands can sense magical ability, Hermione explained, carefully not mentioning that the reaction had been far stronger than anything she had ever seen from a wandless child. And yours is quite powerful indeed. She spent the next hour teaching Harry simple magical theory, the difference between charms and transfiguration, the way magical energy moved through the world, the importance of intention and focus in spellcasting. Harry absorbed every word with the hungry attention of someone who had been starving for this exact kind of knowledge his entire life, asking questions that showed an intuitive understanding of magical principles that would have impressed her professors at Hogwarts. So when I made my teacher's wig turn blue last month, Harry said, working through a particularly complex concept, that was transfiguration? Because I changed what something was instead of just moving it around. Exactly, Hermione confirmed, trying not to smile at the image of Harry's inadvertent revenge on what was undoubtedly an unpleasant teacher. And the fact that you managed color change transfiguration without any training at all is really quite remarkable. Harry beamed at the praise, sitting up straighter on his swing, with the kind of pride that came from being told he was good at something for the first time in recent memory. Will you show me more magic? He asked hopefully. I promise I won't tell anyone. I know my family wouldn't understand, and I don't want to get you in trouble for talking to me about it. The simple kindness of his concern for her welfare, a 7-year-old boy worried about protecting someone who was helping him, made Hermione's chest tight with affection and protective fury in equal measure. I'd love to show you more, she said. But magic is quite powerful, and it can be dangerous if it's not done correctly. Promise me that you won't try to copy anything I do until you're older and have proper training. I promise, Harry said solemnly, crossing his heart with the serious ceremony of a child making a sacred vow. Hermione spent the remaining time showing Harry simple, harmless charms, making flowers bloom out of season, changing the color of fallen leaves, creating tiny lights that danced between her fingers like fireflies. Harry watched each demonstration with rapt attention, occasionally letting out small sounds of delight that reminded her exactly how young he was and how much wonder still existed in his world, despite everything he had endured. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, Harry's questions grew more personal. "Will I really get to go to a magic school when I'm 11? He asked, and there was such naked longing in his voice that Hermione had to blink back unexpected tears. "Yes," she said with absolute certainty. "You'll get a letter on your 11th birthday, and it will tell you exactly what you need to know about enrollment and supplies and how to get there. And when you arrive, you'll discover that you're not strange or unnatural or any of the things your family has told you. You'll discover that you're exactly where you belong." "Will there be other children like me?" Harry asked. "Children who make strange things happen when they're upset?" "Lots of them," Hermione assured him. "And many of them will have grown up with families who didn't understand magic either. You won't be the only one learning everything for the first time." Harry was quiet for a moment, swinging gently back and forth as he processed this information. "Will you be there?" he asked finally, and the hope in his voice was so fragile that Hermione felt something crack in her chest. The question hung in the air between them like a soap bubble, beautiful and impossible and destined to break. Hermione stared at Harry's earnest 7-year-old face and felt the full weight of temporal mechanics pressing down on her shoulders like a stone. How could she explain that she would be there, but as a peer rather than as the older guide he was coming to depend on? How could she tell him that by the time he arrived at Hogwarts, he would have no memory of these conversations, no understanding of the fact that someone had tried to help him through the darkest parts of his childhood? "There will be people there who care about you," she said carefully, choosing words that were true without being specific. "People who will help you and protect you and make sure you're safe." It wasn't a direct answer, but Harry seemed to accept it as close enough. He nodded with the philosophical resignation of someone who had learned to be grateful for partial truths when complete ones weren't forthcoming. "I wish I could tell someone about all of this," he said wistfully. "I wish I could tell my cousin Dudley that I'm not a freak. I'm just different in an interesting way. But I suppose he wouldn't believe me, even if I showed him magic. He doesn't like to think about things that make him feel ordinary." The casual mention of Dudley, 7-year-old Dudley, who was already learning to mirror his parents' cruelty, sent a chill down Hermione's spine. She found herself wondering how much of Harry's isolation was deliberate, and how much was simply the result of growing up in a household where difference was treated as a personal failing. "Sometimes it's better to keep special things private," she said gently, "especially when the people around us aren't ready to understand them yet." Harry nodded sagely, as though this advice confirmed something he had already suspected. "That's what I figured," he said, "but it's nice to have someone to talk to about it. It makes me feel less alone, I suppose." The simple honesty of the statement made Hermione's throat tight with emotion. She looked at Harry, 7 years old, and sitting on a swing in a park where no one would think to look for him, talking about magic with a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to tell him that his greatest source of shame was actually his greatest gift, and felt the terrible weight of knowledge settle around her like a cloak. She was changing things. Every conversation, every moment of kindness, every piece of information she shared was creating ripples that would spread out through time in ways she couldn't predict or control. The Harry Potter who eventually arrived at Hogwarts might be fundamentally different from the one she remembered, shaped by the knowledge that magic existed and that someone, somewhere, had thought he was worth saving. But as she watched his face light up with genuine happiness for the first time since she had met him, Hermione found that she couldn't bring herself to regret the changes she was making. Some things were worth the risk of temporal paradox. Some children were worth saving, even if it meant rewriting history to do it. "I'm glad we're friends," Harry said, as the time-turner began to tug at the edges of her consciousness, pulling her toward her own timeline like a fish on a line. "So am I," Hermione said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As the world dissolved around her, and she tumbled back toward 1993, the last thing she saw was Harry Potter's smile, genuine and unguarded, and full of the kind of hope that could survive anything, even a childhood spent in a cupboard under the stairs. She had given him knowledge. Now she had to figure out how to give him everything else. Hermione had spent 3 sleepless nights in her own timeline, wrestling with the decision, before she finally turned the time-turner for the 4th time. Each rotation of the golden hourglass felt heavier than the last, weighted with the growing certainty that she was no longer simply helping one lonely child, but fundamentally altering the fabric of the wizarding world itself. But Harry's face haunted her dreams. 7 years old and starving for connection, desperate to believe that he wasn't the only person in the world who could make impossible things happen. He needed to know that magic meant community, not just solitude. He needed to understand that being different was something to be celebrated, not hidden away like a shameful secret. Most importantly, he needed friends. The apparition to Devon took more concentration than usual, her magic still humming with temporal energy from the time-turner's influence. When she materialized in the hedgerow that bordered the Weasley property, the familiar sight of the burrow rising up against the afternoon sky filled her with a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension. The house looked exactly as she remembered it from her future visits, a gloriously ramshackle collection of rooms and additions that defied every law of physics and most principles of architecture, held together by magic and love in equal measure. But this was the Burrow of 1987, which meant no older Weasley children home for the holidays, no familiar chaos of teenagers and young adults. Instead, it was a house full of actual children, and Hermione found herself wondering if she was about to make a terrible mistake. Harry was waiting for her at their usual meeting place in the park, sitting on the swing with his legs drawn up beneath him in an unconscious effort to make himself as small as possible. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with the kind of unguarded joy that made her chest ache with protective tenderness. "You came back again," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as though her reliability was something miraculous rather than simply decent. "I promised I would," Hermione replied, settling onto the swing beside him. "And I have something special planned for today, if you're interested." Harry's eyes widened with curiosity. "Special how?" "I thought you might like to meet some other children who can do magic," Hermione said carefully, watching his face for any sign of anxiety or reluctance. "Children your own age who understand what it's like to make strange things happen when you're upset." The transformation in Harry's expression was immediate and heartbreaking. Hope bloomed across his features like sunrise, quickly followed by the kind of desperate uncertainty that belonged to someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust good fortune. "Really," he whispered, "there are other children like me, and they wouldn't think I was strange or frightening." "They would think you were wonderful," Hermione said firmly, "just like I do." The journey to the burrow required a combination of magical transportation that Hermione had to carefully explain to Harry without overwhelming him with concepts he wasn't ready for. She settled on a simplified version of side-along apparition, holding his hand tightly and warning him that it might feel a bit strange, but that he was perfectly safe. Harry's reaction to apparition was everything she could have hoped for. Instead of fear or nausea, his face broke into a delighted grin as they materialized in the garden behind the burrow. "That was brilliant," he exclaimed, looking around with the wide-eyed fascination of someone seeing magic used for practical purposes for the first time. We just disappeared from one place and appeared in another, just like that. Just like that, Hermione agreed, pleased by his enthusiasm. Now, before we go inside, I want you to know that this family is very kind, but also very exuberant. They might seem overwhelming at first, because there are quite a lot of them, but they're good people who care about children. You don't have to worry about being polite or impressive. Just be yourself. Harry nodded solemnly, but she could see the tension in his small frame as he stared up at the impossible architecture of the burrow. "It's really a magical house, isn't it?" he asked in an awed whisper. "Very magical," Hermione confirmed. "The family who lives here has been magical for generations and generations. Magic is as natural to them as breathing." Before Harry could respond, the back door of the burrow burst open with explosive force, revealing two identical red-headed boys who couldn't have been older than 9. They tumbled out into the garden in a tangle of limbs and laughter, chasing what appeared to be a rubber ball that was bouncing in patterns that defied gravity. "Got it!" shouted one of the twins, making a spectacular diving catch that ended with him sprawled face first in Mrs. Weasley's vegetable patch. "No fair, Fred," protested his brother, grinning despite his complaint. "You used magic to make it bounce toward you." "Did not," Fred replied indignantly, sitting up with dirt in his hair and a massive smile on his freckled face. "That was pure athletic prowess and—" He stopped mid-sentence as he noticed Hermione and Harry standing by the garden gate. "Oh, hello." The second twin, George, Hermione realized, scrambled to his feet and joined his brother in staring at the unexpected visitors. Both boys had the characteristic Weasley red hair and freckles, but at 9 years old they still possessed the round-cheeked earnestness of childhood, their mischievous streaks tempered by genuine curiosity. "Are you here to see Mum?" George asked politely, his eyes flickering between Hermione and Harry with open interest. "We are," Hermione said, offering what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "I'm Hermione, and this is Harry. We were hoping to meet some other magical children." The twins exchanged a look that spoke of telepathic communication, developed over years of shared troublemaking. "Magical children, eh?" Fred said, with a grin that was already showing signs of the legendary Weasley mischief. "Well, you've come to the right place. We're very magical indeed." To demonstrate, George pointed at the rubber ball, which immediately sprouted tiny wings and began flying circles around Harry's head. Harry's delighted laughter filled the garden like music, and Hermione felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "That's amazing," Harry exclaimed, reaching up to try to catch the flying ball. "How did you do that?" "Family secret," Fred said with exaggerated mystery. "But we could teach you, if you like. Are you magical, too?" Harry's face went through a complicated series of expressions: excitement, uncertainty, and the familiar shadow of shame that appeared whenever he had to discuss his abilities. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "When I get upset, strange things happen. But I don't know how to do it on purpose like you do." The twins' expressions immediately softened with understanding. "Oh, that's just accidental magic," George said dismissively. "Everyone does that when they're young. Nothing to worry about." "Really?" Harry asked hopefully. "Really?" Fred confirmed. "Our little sister Ginny accidentally turned all the garden gnomes purple last week when she was angry about not being allowed to help with something. Mum said it was perfectly normal. Fred! George! What are you doing out here making all this noise?" The voice came from the back door, warm but exasperated in the way that belonged to mothers everywhere. Molly Weasley emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron and looking every inch the harried mother of a large family. At 37, Molly was a woman in her prime, with the kind of comfortable roundness that spoke of good cooking and generous hugs. Her red hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face carried the particular expression of someone who had learned to expect chaos, but faced it with good humor. "Sorry, Mum," the twins chorused, not looking particularly repentant. "We were just meeting some new friends." Molly's gaze fell on Hermione and Harry, and Hermione watched her expression shift from mild irritation to curiosity, to something that might have been concern as she took in Harry's appearance. Even cleaned up and wearing his best clothes, Harry still looked underfed and uncertain, in a way that would activate every maternal instinct Molly Weasley possessed. "Well then," Molly said, her voice gentle but carrying an undertone that suggested she was making rapid assessments and coming to conclusions she didn't entirely like. "Let's not leave our guest standing in the garden. Come inside, both of you. I'll put the kettle on." The interior of the burrow was even more magical than Hermione remembered from her future visits. Every surface seemed to be in motion, knitting needles clicking away at a half-finished jumper, dishes washing themselves in the sink, a broom sweeping the hearth without any human intervention. But it was also unmistakably a home, filled with the comfortable clutter of a family that valued warmth over tidiness. Harry stopped just inside the kitchen doorway and stared around him with the expression of someone who had just discovered that fairy tales might be real after all. "It's wonderful," he breathed, watching a wooden spoon stir a pot of soup by itself. "Everything is moving and working and alive." "That's just how magical houses work," came a voice from the kitchen table. A serious-looking boy with neat red hair and wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from what appeared to be an extremely advanced textbook. "Magic makes everything more efficient. I'm Percy Weasley. Are you here for educational purposes?" Even at 10 years old, Percy had the earnest intensity that would define his character, though it was tempered by the genuine curiosity of a child rather than the rigid ambition that would develop later. "Educational and social purposes," Hermione said diplomatically. "Harry is just learning about magic, and I thought he might benefit from meeting other magical children." "Oh, brilliant!" A new voice piped up from under the kitchen table, and a moment later, a boy with hair as red as his brother's emerged from what appeared to be a fort constructed from chair legs and dish towels. "Another person my age. I'm Ron. Are you really new to magic? That must be dead exciting, learning about it all for the first time." Ron Weasley at 7 was all elbows and knees and enthusiasm, with a wide grin and bright blue eyes that sparkled with the kind of mischief that was more curious than malicious. He scrambled to his feet and approached Harry with the confident friendliness of someone who had never met a person he couldn't eventually charm. "I'm Harry," Harry said shyly, but Hermione could see the immediate spark of connection between the two boys. There was something about Ron's uncomplicated enthusiasm that seemed to set Harry at ease, in a way that adult kindness couldn't quite manage. "Want to see my room?" Ron asked eagerly. "I've got chocolate frog cards and a really good collection of interesting rocks, and if you ask nicely, Percy might show you his prefect badge, even though he's not actually a prefect yet." "I'm practicing for when I get to Hogwarts," Percy said with dignity. "Preparation is the key to success in academic endeavors." Harry looked to Hermione for permission, and she nodded encouragingly. She watched the two 7-year-olds disappear up the crooked staircase together, Ron chattering excitedly about Quidditch and spell books, and all the wonderful things Harry had to look forward to when he started his magical education. "Nice boy," Molly said quietly, settling a cup of tea in front of Hermione. "But thin. Too thin. And those clothes." She trailed off, but her expression said everything her words didn't. "His home situation is difficult," Hermione said carefully. "His guardians don't approve of magic." Molly's face darkened with the particular kind of anger that belonged to mothers who had encountered child neglect. "Don't approve of magic?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "What kind of people don't approve of a child having magical gifts?" Before Hermione could answer, a small figure emerged from behind the kitchen counter. Ginny Weasley at 5 was tiny even for her age, with bright red hair that fell in waves around her shoulders and brown eyes that were already showing signs of the fierce intelligence she would be known for. She clutched a battered stuffed dragon to her chest and stared at Hermione with the intense curiosity of someone who had heard interesting things and wanted to know more. "Mum," Ginny said in a whisper that was probably meant to be private, but carried clearly across the kitchen. "Is that really Harry Potter?" Hermione felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. In all her planning and preparation, she had somehow failed to consider the possibility that the Weasley children might recognize Harry's name. Of course they would know who he was. Every magical child born since 1981 would have grown up hearing the story of the boy who lived. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" Molly asked gently, though her sharp eyes were fixed on Hermione with sudden understanding. "He's got dark hair like the stories say," Ginny said, still whispering. "And he's the right age. And—" She hesitated, then added in an even smaller voice, "and he looks sad like someone whose parents died would look." The simple honesty of a 5-year-old's observation hit Hermione like a physical blow. She looked at Molly and saw her own realization reflected in the older woman's eyes. They both understood exactly who Harry was, and exactly why Hermione had brought him here. "He is," Hermione said quietly, "but he doesn't know that yet. He doesn't know about his parents, or about what happened, or about any of the things that make him famous. Right now, he's just a 7-year-old boy who lives with people who hate magic and has never had a friend in his life." Molly's expression went through a complicated series of emotions: surprise, anger, determination, and finally a fierce protectiveness that Hermione recognized as the beginning of the legendary maternal devotion that would define Molly's relationship with Harry for the rest of his life. "Well then," Molly said, setting down her teacup with the kind of decisiveness that had won wars and raised families, "I suppose we'd better make sure he knows what it feels like to be part of one." As if summoned by the conversation, the sound of laughter drifted down from upstairs, Harry's bright giggle mixing with Ron's distinctive snort of amusement and the twins' delighted whoops of joy. It was the sound of children being children, uncomplicated and joyful, and exactly what Harry had been missing his entire life. Hermione felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. She had done the right thing in bringing Harry here. Whatever complications this created, whatever risks she was taking with the timeline, Harry Potter deserved to know what it felt like to be welcomed into a magical family, even if it meant changing everything. The first sign that something had changed came during Albus Dumbledore's weekly review of the monitoring charms he maintained around Harry Potter's residence. The headmaster sat in his circular office at Hogwarts, the soft afternoon light filtering through the tall windows as he examined the delicate magical instruments that tracked the boy's welfare with the focused attention of someone who had learned, over the course of 105 years of life, that the smallest details often carried the greatest significance. The silver instruments hummed with their usual quiet efficiency, spinning and clicking and measuring magical signatures with precision that would have impressed even the most demanding Department of Mysteries researcher. But today, something was different. Where the readings should have shown the steady, controlled emanations of a child's natural magical development, tempered by the protective wards around Privet Drive, there were instead fluctuations that spoke of external magical influence. Dumbledore leaned forward, his blue eyes sharp behind his half-moon spectacles, as he adjusted the most sensitive of the instruments. The readings were unmistakable. Someone with considerable magical ability had been visiting Harry Potter on a regular basis. Someone who knew enough about temporal magic to leave traces that resonated with chronomantic energy. "Most curious," Dumbledore murmured to himself, stroking his already impressive beard as he contemplated the implications. The blood protection surrounding Harry was designed to keep threats away from the boy, but it was also meant to keep the magical world away from him until he was old enough to understand and cope with the burden of his fame. Premature exposure to magical society could be just as dangerous as leaving him vulnerable to Death Eaters. He reached for a piece of parchment and began composing a letter in his careful, flowing script. "My dear Minerva, I would be most grateful if you could spare the time for a brief reconnaissance mission to Little Whinging. Our instruments suggest that young Harry has been receiving unexpected visitors of a magical nature, and I believe it would be prudent to ascertain the nature and intent of these encounters. Your discretion, as always, will be invaluable in this matter. Most sincerely, Albus." 3 hours later, Professor McGonagall materialized with a soft pop of apparition behind the carefully manicured hedge that bordered Wisteria Walk. At 51, Minerva McGonagall was a woman in her prime, possessed of the kind of sharp intelligence and practical competence that had made her one of the most respected witches of her generation. Her dark hair was pulled back in its characteristic tight bun, and her emerald robes were pristine despite the journey, but there was something in her expression that spoke of deep concern, carefully held in check. She had helped place Harry Potter on the doorstep of Privet Drive 6 years ago, against every instinct she possessed about the Dursleys' character. The decision had been Albus's to make, and she trusted his wisdom, but that didn't mean she had to like it. Any excuse to check on the boy's welfare was welcome, even if it came wrapped in concerns about unauthorized magical contact. McGonagall settled herself behind the hedge, with the patient stillness of someone who had spent decades perfecting her animagus transformation, and began her vigil. She didn't have long to wait. The back door of number 4 Privet Drive opened with characteristic violence, and Harry Potter emerged into the garden with the quick, nervous movements of someone eager to be away from whatever lay behind him. McGonagall felt her heart clench at the sight of him. Still too thin, still too small, still carrying himself with the careful wariness of a child who had learned that attracting attention rarely led to anything good. But there was something different about him today. Something in his posture that spoke of anticipation rather than resignation, as though he was looking forward to something instead of simply enduring it. Harry made his way through the neighborhood with the confident steps of someone following a familiar route, and McGonagall followed at a careful distance, her trained eye cataloguing every detail of his appearance and behavior. He moved with more purpose than she would have expected from a 7-year-old boy with nowhere in particular to go, and there was an alertness to his expression that suggested he was expecting to meet someone. The park where Harry finally stopped was small and unremarkable, the kind of place where neighborhood children might play if they were allowed to associate with him. McGonagall concealed herself behind a cluster of trees and watched as Harry settled onto one of the swings, his small hands gripping the chains as he scanned the area with obvious expectation. He wasn't alone for long. The girl who approached couldn't have been more than 13 or 14, with bushy brown hair and the kind of earnest expression that McGonagall associated with her most dedicated students. But there was something about her that set off every professional alarm McGonagall possessed, a magical signature that hummed with temporal energy and a confidence that belonged to someone far older than her apparent age. "Hello, Harry," the girl said, as she settled onto the swing beside him, and McGonagall noticed immediately that Harry's face lit up with genuine pleasure at her arrival. "Hermione!" Harry exclaimed, and there was such warmth in his voice that McGonagall felt something ease in her chest, even as her concerns about the situation deepened. "I was hoping you'd come today. I have so many questions about what you showed me yesterday." McGonagall watched the interaction with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence. The girl, Hermione, spoke to Harry with the careful gentleness of someone who understood that he had been hurt and was determined not to add to that damage. Harry responded with the eager attentiveness of someone who had been starving for exactly this kind of patient, knowledgeable companionship. But there was something about the girl that didn't quite fit. Her magical signature was far too sophisticated for her apparent age, and the way she spoke about magical concepts suggested a level of education that should have been impossible for someone who couldn't yet be in her final years at Hogwarts. "Hermione," Harry said, as they swung gently back and forth, "I've been thinking about what you said about magic schools and letters that come when you turn 11. But there's something I don't understand." "What's that?" Hermione asked, and McGonagall noted the careful way she pitched her voice to encourage questions without seeming eager for them. "If there are schools for magical children, and if the magical world knows about me because of what happened to my parents." Harry paused, his 7-year-old mind working through concepts that were far too complex for someone his age to have to consider. Why was I left with people who hate magic? Why wasn't I raised by magical people who could teach me about it and help me understand what I can do? The question hung in the air between them like a physical thing, weighted with the kind of innocent curiosity that could topple governments and destroy carefully laid plans. McGonagall felt her breath catch as she waited for Hermione's response, knowing that whatever explanation the girl offered would either comfort Harry or plant seeds of doubt that could grow into serious problems. Hermione was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through what McGonagall recognized as the internal struggle of someone choosing between several inadequate options. "That's a very good question," Hermione said finally, "and the answer is complicated. Sometimes, when very bad people are looking for someone, the best way to keep that person safe is to hide them somewhere the bad people wouldn't think to look." "But the bad people aren't looking for me anymore, are they?" Harry asked with the relentless logic of childhood. "You said they were defeated when I was a baby. So why can't I be with magical people now?" McGonagall found herself leaning forward, despite her determination to remain unobserved. This was the heart of the matter, the question that went to the core of Albus's decision 6 years ago, and the reasoning that even she didn't fully understand. "The magic that protects you is very old and very powerful," Hermione said carefully, "but it only works as long as you live with family. Not just any family, blood family. The same blood that your mother had when she died to save you." Harry's brow furrowed with the effort of understanding concepts that would challenge most adult wizards. "So the magic comes from my mum?" he asked. "From your mum's love," Hermione confirmed, "and it's the strongest protection anyone has ever created. But it has to be maintained by living with someone who shares her blood. That's why you're with your aunt, even though she doesn't understand magic." "My aunt doesn't love me, though," Harry said, matter-of-factly, without any trace of self-pity. "She mostly just wishes I wasn't there. Does the protection still work if the family doesn't actually care about you?" The question hit McGonagall like a physical blow, and she saw Hermione flinch, as though Harry's casual honesty had wounded her. "Yes," Hermione said quietly. "The protection doesn't depend on their feelings. It depends on the connection through blood and the magic your mother created when she chose to die for you. But Harry..." She paused, and McGonagall could see her struggling with how much to say to a 7-year-old about the complexities of magical protection and family obligation. The people who placed you there care about you very much. They made a very difficult decision because they wanted to keep you safe, even though they knew it would be hard for you. They know about me? Harry asked with sudden interest. The magical people who placed me there? Do you think they ever wonder how I'm doing? I think they wonder about you every day, Hermione said, with such quiet conviction that McGonagall felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. And I think that when you're older and the protection isn't needed anymore, you'll understand why they made the choices they did. Harry nodded thoughtfully, processing this information with the serious consideration it deserved. I suppose it makes sense, he said finally. I don't like it, but I suppose sometimes grown-ups have to make decisions that children don't understand. The mature resignation in his voice made McGonagall's chest ache with protective fury. 7 years old, and he was already learning to accept that his own happiness was secondary to larger considerations. It was necessary, perhaps even wise, but that didn't make it any less heartbreaking. Harry, Hermione said gently, I want you to know that being protected doesn't mean being forgotten. There are people in the magical world who think about you and care about your well-being and want you to be happy. Just because they can't be with you doesn't mean they don't love you. Do you really think so? Harry asked hopefully. I know so, Hermione said with absolute certainty. McGonagall watched them continue their conversation for another hour, noting the way Harry absorbed every piece of information about magical theory with the hungry attention of someone who had been starving for exactly this kind of knowledge. Hermione was careful with her explanations, offering just enough to satisfy his curiosity without overwhelming him with concepts he wasn't ready for. But there was something about the entire interaction that troubled McGonagall, beyond the obvious concerns about unauthorized contact. The girl seemed to know far too much about Harry's situation, spoke about the magical world with the confidence of someone who had been part of it for years, rather than someone who should still be learning the basics herself. And underneath it all was the persistent sense that McGonagall was watching something that had happened before, or perhaps would happen again. The temporal magic signature that clung to the girl suggested complications that went far beyond a simple case of unauthorized contact with a magical child. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, McGonagall made her decision. She had seen enough to write a comprehensive report for Albus, but more importantly, she had seen enough to understand that this situation required delicate handling rather than immediate intervention. Harry Potter was receiving magical education from someone who clearly cared about his welfare and understood the complexities of his situation. His demeanor was markedly improved from her last observation of him, and his questions showed a level of thoughtful engagement that spoke well for his emotional development. But whoever Hermione was, wherever she had come from, her presence represented a fundamental disruption to the careful isolation that was supposed to protect Harry until his Hogwarts letter arrived. And the temporal magic that surrounded her suggested complications that could affect far more than one lonely boy's childhood education. As McGonagall prepared to return to Hogwarts with her report, she caught a glimpse of Hermione's face as the girl said goodbye to Harry. The expression she saw there, protective, determined, and touched with the kind of fierce love that moved mountains and toppled empires, told her everything she needed to know about the girl's motivations. Whatever else Hermione might be, whatever complications her presence might create, she loved Harry Potter with the wholehearted devotion of someone who would sacrifice anything to see him safe and happy. And perhaps, McGonagall thought, as she disapparated back to Scotland, that was the most important thing of all. Hermione had known this moment was coming from the first day she met Harry in the park, had seen it approaching like a storm on the horizon with each question he asked and each careful answer she gave. But knowing something was inevitable didn't make it any easier when Harry Potter looked at her with his 7-year-old eyes full of trust and curiosity, and asked the question she had been dreading most. "Hermione," Harry said, as they sat on their usual swings in the small park that had become their sanctuary, "will you tell me how my parents really died?" The time-turner around her neck felt heavier than lead as Hermione met his gaze, seeing in his green eyes the same courage that had defined his parents and would one day define him. But right now, he was just a little boy who had been lied to about the most fundamental facts of his own existence, and she was about to burden him with knowledge that no 7-year-old should have to carry. "Harry," she said carefully, buying herself time to find words that would tell the truth without destroying what remained of his childhood innocence. "That's a very serious question. Are you sure you're ready to know the answer?" Harry nodded with the solemn dignity that she had come to recognize as his default response to anything that mattered deeply to him. "I've been thinking about it for days," he said quietly. "My aunt and uncle told me that my parents died in a car crash because they were drunk and irresponsible. But that never made sense to me. Why would magical people die in something as ordinary as a car accident? And why would telling me the truth be dangerous enough to lie about?" Hermione felt her heart break a little at the matter-of-fact way he recited the Dursleys' cruel fiction, delivered with the resignation of someone who had never expected kindness from the people who were supposed to care for him. "Your aunt and uncle lied to you," she said gently. "Everything they told you about your parents was a lie." Harry's hands tightened on the swing chains, but his expression remained steady. "I know," he said simply. "I've known for a while. I was just waiting for someone to tell me the truth." The quiet dignity of his response made Hermione's throat tight with emotion. Here was a 7-year-old boy who had figured out that the adults in his life were lying to him about something fundamental, and instead of becoming angry or demanding answers, he had simply waited with patient hope for someone trustworthy enough to tell him the truth. "Your parents," Hermione began, choosing each word with the care of someone defusing a bomb, "were very brave people who died, fighting against an extremely dangerous dark wizard. They didn't die because they were careless or foolish. They died because they were heroes." Harry was very still for a moment, processing this information with the focused attention he brought to all discussions of magic and the world he had been kept from understanding. "Heroes," he repeated quietly. "They were fighting someone bad?" "The worst dark wizard who had ever existed," Hermione said. "His name was Voldemort, and he wanted to take over the magical world and hurt anyone who tried to stop him. Your parents were part of a group of people who fought against him and his followers. And he killed them for it," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Hermione confirmed. "But Harry, there's more to the story than that. Something extraordinary happened the night your parents died. Something that made you very famous in the magical world." Harry tilted his head to one side, his expression shifting from grief to curiosity. "Famous? Me?" Hermione took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to tell him would change everything. His understanding of himself, his place in the world, and the weight of expectations that would follow him for the rest of his life. "When Voldemort came to your house that night, he killed your father first, and then your mother. But when he tried to kill you—" She paused, seeing Harry's face pale at the casual mention of someone trying to murder him when he was a baby. "The killing curse that should have killed you bounced back and destroyed him instead. You survived something that no one had ever survived before. That's why people call you the boy who lived. Harry stared at her in absolute silence for a long moment, his green eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Someone tried to kill me when I was a baby," he said slowly, working through the implications. "And my mother died protecting me. And then... What, the magic just bounced off?" "Your mother's love protected you," Hermione explained. "When she chose to die for you instead of stepping aside, she created a protection so powerful that it destroyed the person trying to hurt you. It's the strongest magic that exists, the magic of sacrifice and love." Harry's expression went through a complicated series of changes: wonder, grief, confusion, and something that might have been pride, all chasing each other across his features. "So I'm famous," he said finally. "In the magical world, everyone knows who I am." "Everyone," Hermione confirmed. "You're probably the most famous person in magical Britain, maybe in the entire magical world." "That's why my aunt and uncle hate talking about magic," Harry realized with the sharp insight that constantly surprised her. "They know I'm famous for something they can't understand or control." "I think that's part of it." "Yes," Hermione agreed. Harry was quiet for a long moment, swinging gently back and forth as he processed everything she had told him. When he spoke again, his voice was small and uncertain. "Hermione, if my parents died fighting this Voldemort person, and if everyone in the magical world knows who I am, why don't I have any family in the magical world? Why wasn't I raised by people who knew my parents, or who could tell me stories about them?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything, and Hermione felt the familiar ache of knowing too much about decisions that had been made for reasons a 7-year-old couldn't be expected to understand or accept. "You do have magical family," she said carefully. "There was someone who was supposed to take care of you if anything happened to your parents. Someone who loved your father like a brother." "What happened to them?" Harry asked hopefully. "He was arrested," Hermione said, and watched Harry's face fall. "The same night your parents died, he was accused of betraying them to Voldemort, of telling the Dark Wizard where to find your family." "Did he?" Harry asked quietly. "No," Hermione said with absolute certainty. "He was innocent, but he was sent to prison anyway. And by the time anyone realized the truth, the magical authorities had already placed you with your aunt and uncle." Harry's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Hermione saw a flash of the terrible anger that would one day make him such a formidable wizard. "They sent an innocent man to prison," Harry demanded, "and left me with people who hate me because they were too lazy to find out the truth?" "It's more complicated than that," Hermione said, though privately she agreed with his assessment more than she could safely admit. "The people who made those decisions thought they were protecting you. They were terrified that Voldemort's followers would try to hurt you if they knew where you were, so they hid you in a place where no one would think to look. With people who tell me my parents were drunks and that I'm a freak for making strange things happen," Harry said bitterly. "Some protection." The anger in his voice was heartbreaking. Not the petulant rage of a child denied something he wanted, but the deep, bone-level fury of someone who had realized that the adults responsible for his welfare had failed him in fundamental ways. "Harry," Hermione said gently, "I know it's unfair. I know it hurts. But the people who made those decisions, they were trying to keep you alive. Sometimes grown-ups have to make choices between terrible options, and sometimes they make mistakes even when they're trying to do the right thing." "The man who was supposed to take care of me," Harry said, ignoring her attempt at comfort. "The one who was sent to prison. What's his name?" Hermione hesitated, knowing that giving Harry this information would only add to his sense of injustice and abandonment. "Sirius Black," she said finally. "He was your father's best friend. They were like brothers." "Sirius Black," Harry repeated, testing the name. "And he's still in prison, even though he didn't do anything wrong?" "Yes," Hermione said quietly. Harry was silent for a long time, staring down at his hands with an expression that was far too old for his 7-year-old face. When he finally looked up, his green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They took away my parents," he said quietly. "And then they took away the person who was supposed to love me after my parents were gone. And then they gave me to people who think I'm a burden and a freak. And everyone in the magical world knows who I am, but none of them care enough to check if I'm actually okay." The simple, devastating accuracy of his summary hit Hermione like a physical blow. She wanted to argue with him, to explain about blood protection and strategic necessity and all the complex magical and political considerations that had shaped the decisions made about his life. But looking at his small, serious face, she realized that all of those explanations were just elaborate ways of saying that his happiness and emotional well-being had been considered less important than other priorities. "Harry," she said, reaching over to take his hand, "I want you to know something very important. What happened to you wasn't fair. The adults who made decisions about your life, they may have had good reasons, but that doesn't mean their choices were right. You deserved better. You deserved to be loved and cared for, and told the truth about who you are." Harry looked down at their joined hands, and Hermione could see him struggling with emotions that no child should have to process. "Why are you telling me all of this?" he asked finally. "If everyone else thinks it's better for me not to know, why are you different?" The question struck at the heart of everything Hermione had been grappling with since she first turned the Time Turner. Why was she here? What gave her the right to disrupt carefully laid plans and reveal secrets that had been kept for Harry's own protection? "Because," she said slowly, working through the answer as she spoke, "I think you have a right to know who you are. I think you have a right to understand your own history, and to be proud of your parents, and to know that what happened to you wasn't your fault. And I think—" She paused, feeling the weight of temporal mechanics pressing against her consciousness. "I think sometimes 7-year-old boys are braver and stronger than the adults around them realize." Harry was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Hermione," he said finally, "when I go to magical school in 4 years, will people expect me to be special because of what happened when I was a baby?" The question revealed a level of insight that took Hermione's breath away. At 7 years old, Harry had immediately grasped one of the central challenges that would define his entire educational experience. "Some will," she admitted. "But the people who matter, your real friends, they'll like you for who you are, not for what happened to you. And the man in prison? Sirius Black? When I'm older, will anyone try to prove he's innocent?" Hermione felt her chest tighten with the weight of knowledge she couldn't share. She thought about the 12 years Sirius would spend in Azkaban, the way his sanity would fragment under the Dementor's influence, the desperate man Harry would meet when he was 13, and the complex relationship they would build before it was cut short by tragedy. "I believe the truth always comes out eventually," she said carefully. "But it might take a very long time." Harry nodded with the grim acceptance of someone who had learned early that justice was not always swift or certain. "I want to meet him someday," Harry said quietly. "When I'm older. I want to hear stories about my parents from someone who actually knew them." "I think you will," Hermione said, and meant it with all her heart. As the sun began to set and the Time Turner's pull grew stronger, Hermione looked at Harry Potter, 7 years old and sitting on a swing in a park where no one would think to look for the most famous child in the magical world, and felt the terrible weight of what she had just done. She had given him truth, but she had also given him burden. She had answered his questions, but she had also planted seeds of anger and resentment that would grow in the dark corners of his childhood and shape the man he would become. Most dangerously of all, she had given him knowledge that would make every day at Privet Drive harder to bear, every lie from the Dursleys more painful, every moment of isolation more bitter. But as she watched him process the truth with courage and dignity that would have impressed the adults who had failed him so completely, Hermione knew she had made the right choice. Some truths were too important to keep hidden, even from 7-year-old boys who deserved better from the world than they had been given, especially from 7-year-old boys who deserved better. The first official report of temporal anomalies around Surrey reached the desk of Minister Millicent Bagnold on a Tuesday morning in late October, buried among the routine intelligence briefings that crossed her attention during the post-war period of cautious normalcy that had defined her administration since 1980. At 64, Minister Bagnold had survived the First Wizarding War, the chaos of Voldemort's defeat, and the delicate political reconstruction that followed, but she had never encountered anything quite like the magical signature analysis that her Department of Mysteries investigators had compiled. "Minister," said the junior assistant who delivered the report, trying to hide his nervousness behind professional competence, "the unspeakables believe this requires your immediate attention." Bagnold studied the parchment with the focused intensity of someone who had learned, over 7 years in office, that the most innocuous-looking reports often contained the seeds of the most serious crises. The technical language was dense and precise, but the implications were clear. Someone with access to advanced temporal magic had been making repeated trips to the same location in Surrey, creating chronomantic resonances that were detectable from as far away as London. The location itself was even more concerning than the magical signature. The coordinates placed the temporal disturbances within a half-mile radius of the residence of Harry Potter. "Send word to the Department of Mysteries," Bagnold said, after reading the report twice. "I want their best investigators on this immediately, and arrange a meeting with Albus Dumbledore. If someone is interfering with the Potter boys' protection, I need to know about it." Within hours, 3 unspeakables had apparated to various points around Little Whinging, their magical instruments humming with the kind of sophisticated detection spells that the general public never saw and never suspected existed. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The temporal signatures were not only real but recent, following a pattern that suggested regular, systematic time travel, with the precision of someone operating on a carefully planned schedule. The trail led them, inevitably, to King's Cross Station. "The magical resonance is strongest here," reported Unspeakable Croaker to his colleagues as they stood in the concealed alcove behind Platform 9 3/4, where Hermione had first appeared in 1987. Multiple arrivals and departures, all originating from the same temporal coordinates. Whoever is doing this has been using the same departure point for weeks. "Advanced time-turner usage," observed Unspeakable Saul, adjusting his instruments to track the chronomantic echoes. "Not the simple hour reversal charms we issue to students. This is someone with access to unrestricted temporal magic, moving backward through significant spans of time. And they know enough about concealment to choose Platform 9 3/4 as their arrival point," added the third investigator grimly. "This isn't random experimentation. This is a deliberate operation." The report that reached Minister Bagnold's desk 6 hours later was concise and deeply troubling. An unknown individual with considerable magical ability had been using advanced time travel to visit 1987 on multiple occasions, with particular focus on areas surrounding Harry Potter's residence. The implications for the security of the most famous child in Wizarding Britain were staggering. "Get me Dumbledore," Bagnold said to her secretary. "Now." Albus Dumbledore arrived at the Ministry within the hour, his blue eyes grave behind his half-moon spectacles, and his usually serene expression touched with the kind of concern that made experienced politicians nervous. At 105, the headmaster of Hogwarts commanded respect that transcended normal political boundaries, but even he was not above questioning when it came to matters of national security. "Albus," Minister Bagnold said, without preamble, as Dumbledore settled into the chair across from her desk, "we have a problem. Someone has been using advanced time travel to conduct unauthorized visits to Harry Potter's location. Our investigators have confirmed multiple temporal incursions over the past several weeks." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, his long fingers steepled as he processed this information with the careful deliberation of someone who had just been presented with a puzzle of considerable complexity. "I see," he said finally. "And do your investigators have any insight into the identity or motivations of this individual?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me," Bagnold replied sharply. "The boy is under your specific protection, Albus. The Blood Ward magic, the placement with his relatives, the monitoring charms, all of that falls under your jurisdiction. If someone has been interfering with Harry Potter's security, I need to know whether you authorized it." "I did not," Dumbledore said with quiet certainty. "The protections around Harry are designed to be self-contained and unobtrusive. I would not authorize any intervention that might compromise their effectiveness or draw unwanted attention to the boy's location. Then we have an unauthorized magical operative conducting temporal reconnaissance around the most valuable target in Britain," Bagnold said grimly. "Someone with the skill and resources to bypass our detection systems and the knowledge to target Harry Potter specifically." "The temporal signatures?" Dumbledore asked thoughtfully. "Do they suggest hostile intent?" "That's the puzzling part," Bagnold admitted. "The magical resonances don't match known dark arts applications. If anything, the chronomantic profile suggests protective rather than predatory magic. But regardless of intent, unauthorized time travel around Harry Potter represents an unacceptable security risk." Dumbledore nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and implications. "What do you propose?" he asked. "Increased surveillance," Bagnold said decisively. "Department of Mysteries investigators stationed around Little Whinging on a rotating schedule. Enhanced detection spells at all major apparition points. And if we identify the individual responsible—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Depending on their motivations, we may need to consider detention for questioning." "I understand," Dumbledore said quietly. "Though I would ask that any action taken consider the possibility that whoever is doing this believes themselves to be acting in Harry's best interests." "Good intentions don't excuse violations of temporal magic regulations," Bagnold replied, "or unauthorized interference with ministry security protocols. Whoever this is, they've placed themselves on the wrong side of the law." Meanwhile, in 1987, Hermione Granger sat on her usual swing in the small park where she had been meeting Harry for weeks, trying to reconcile the growing sense of magical surveillance she felt pressing against her consciousness with the need to continue her mission. Something had changed in the magical atmosphere around Little Whinging, a persistent sense of being watched that made her skin crawl and her magical senses buzz with alarm. "You seem different today," Harry observed with the perceptive directness that never failed to surprise her. "Worried about something?" Hermione looked at him, 7 years old and swinging gently beside her, his green eyes bright with curiosity and concern, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders like stone. "Harry," she said carefully, "how good are you at keeping secrets?" "Very good," Harry said solemnly. "I've had lots of practice." The simple honesty of his response made Hermione's chest tight with protective fury. Of course he was good at keeping secrets. He had been forced to hide everything that mattered to him from the people who were supposed to care for his welfare. "I need you to listen very carefully," she said, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "The magic that I've been using to visit you, it's starting to attract attention from people we don't want noticing us." Harry's expression grew serious with the kind of focused attention he brought to anything that might threaten their friendship. "Bad people?" he asked quietly. "Not bad exactly," Hermione said, "but official people. People who work for the magical government and who might not understand why I'm here or what we've been talking about. They would try to stop you from visiting me," Harry realized with the sharp insight that constantly amazed her. "They might," Hermione confirmed. "And they might also punish me for breaking rules about time magic and unauthorized contact with magical children." Harry was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the serious consideration it deserved. "What would happen to you?" he asked. "If they caught you?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything Hermione had been trying not to think about. Temporal magic violations carried serious penalties: imprisonment in Azkaban, destruction of time-turners, complete restriction from chronomantic research. But more than that, being caught would mean the end of her ability to help Harry through the darkest parts of his childhood. "I could get in very serious trouble," she said honestly. "The kind of trouble that would mean I couldn't visit you anymore." Harry's face fell, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was, a 7-year-old boy facing the possibility of losing the only person who had ever treated him with consistent kindness. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked hopefully. "To make it harder for them to find you?" Hermione felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest at his immediate impulse to help protect her, even though he was the one who would suffer most if their meetings were discovered. "Actually, yes," she said. "There are some basic magical concealment techniques I can teach you. Nothing advanced," she added quickly, seeing his eyes light up with excitement. "But simple things that will help hide the fact that you've been around magical people." For the next hour, Hermione taught Harry the fundamentals of magical concealment, how to calm his magical signature when he was upset, how to avoid the kind of accidental magic that left detectable traces, how to seem completely ordinary and unremarkable when adult wizards might be watching. Harry absorbed the lessons with the hungry attention he brought to all magical education, but Hermione could see the underlying sadness in his eyes as he began to understand the implications of what she was teaching him. "You're preparing me for you to go away, aren't you?" he asked as the lesson wound down. The quiet resignation in his voice nearly broke her heart. "I'm preparing for the possibility that our meetings might have to become less frequent," she said carefully. "Or that we might have to be more careful about when and where we see each other." "But you'll still come back?" Harry asked, and there was such desperate hope in his voice that Hermione felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "As long as I can," she promised. "As long as it's safe for both of us." Harry nodded with the brave acceptance of someone who had learned early that good things were often temporary, and that the people who cared about him usually had to leave eventually. "Hermione," he said quietly, "thank you for teaching me about magic and about my parents and about everything. Even if the government people find out and you have to stop coming, I want you to know that meeting you has been the best thing that's ever happened to me." The simple honesty of his gratitude hit Hermione like a physical blow. She reached over and pulled him into a hug that was fierce enough to convey everything she couldn't say about how much he meant to her, and how desperately she wanted to keep him safe. "You're going to be extraordinary, Harry Potter," she whispered into his messy dark hair. "Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." As the time turner began its familiar pull toward her own timeline, Hermione held tight to the memory of Harry's arms around her, and his whispered promise to practice the concealment techniques she had taught him. She was running out of time, in more ways than one. But she wasn't ready to give up on him yet. Not while there was still hope of creating a future where Harry Potter grew up knowing he was loved. The change in Harry Potter began subtly, in small acts of resistance that would have been unremarkable in any other 7-year-old, but were revolutionary, coming from a child who had spent his entire life learning to make himself invisible. It started with questions, direct, unflinching inquiries about his parents that he delivered with the confidence of someone who finally knew the truth and was no longer willing to accept lies. "My parents didn't die in a car crash," Harry announced over dinner on a particularly tense evening in November, his green eyes fixed on his aunt with the kind of steady regard that made adults uncomfortable. "They died fighting dark wizards. They were heroes." The silence that followed this statement was so absolute that the only sound in the kitchen was the tick of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Harry sat perfectly still in his chair, his small hands folded in his lap, waiting for a response with the patient determination of someone who had finally decided that the truth was worth whatever consequences might follow. "Don't," his aunt said, in a voice that carried the particular kind of warning that children learned to recognize as dangerous. "Speak such nonsense in this house." "It's not nonsense," Harry replied with quiet dignity. "It's the truth. My mother died to save me from a dark wizard named Voldemort. That's why I have this scar, and that's why I can do magic. Because I'm a wizard, just like my parents were." The explosion of fury that followed this calm declaration was swift and violent. Harry's uncle surged to his feet with a roar of rage that seemed to shake the walls of the small kitchen, his face purpling with the kind of apoplectic anger that belonged to men who had built their entire identity around the control of others. "No!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain of his fury. "There will be no talk of that freakishness in this house. We've spent 6 years trying to stamp the unnaturalness out of you, and we won't have you undoing all that work with your sick fantasies." But Harry didn't flinch. For the first time in his 7 years of life, he met his uncle's rage with something that resembled calm defiance. "You can't stamp magic out of people," Harry said quietly. "It's part of who I am. And calling my parents freaks doesn't make them any less heroic or any less dead or any less my family." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Harry's uncle accepted it with the kind of violence that had been building for weeks as the boy became increasingly difficult to intimidate. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. Harry's uncle reached for him with hands that had delivered punishment many times before. But this time, Harry's fear and anger combined into something that transcended normal childhood emotion. The magical energy that had been building inside him for days, fed by new knowledge and suppressed fury and the desperate need to defend himself, finally found its release. Every piece of glass in the kitchen exploded simultaneously. The windows shattered inward, sending crystalline fragments flying across the room like deadly snow. The drinking glasses on the counter burst into powder. The glass-fronted cabinets disintegrated, their contents tumbling to the floor in an avalanche of ceramic and metal. Even the light bulbs overhead popped and went dark, plunging the kitchen into the eerie half-light that filtered through the now empty window frames. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed the destruction, Harry sat frozen in his chair, staring at the chaos around him, with the wide-eyed shock of someone who had just discovered they possessed far more power than they had ever imagined. The magical energy release was so violent, so uncontrolled, that it sent ripples through the protective ward surrounding 4 Privet Drive like stones thrown into still water. Deep beneath the everyday bustle of the suburban neighborhood, ancient magic stirred and shifted, responding to the emotional turmoil of the child it had been crafted to protect. In his circular office at Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore felt the ward fluctuations as a sharp, discordant note that cut through his evening meditation like a knife. The delicate instruments that monitored Harry's welfare began to chime and spin with frantic urgency, their silver components flashing in patterns that spoke of magical distress and systemic instability. Most concerning, Dumbledore murmured to himself as he studied the readings with growing alarm. The blood protection that surrounded Harry was designed to be stable and self-sustaining, powered by the ancient magic of Lily Potter's sacrifice and reinforced by the bond between blood relatives. It should not have been fluctuating like this, should not have been responding to Harry's emotional state with such volatile energy. Unless, of course, something had fundamentally changed about Harry himself. Dumbledore reached for his traveling cloak with the swift decisiveness of someone who had just realized that a carefully balanced situation was spiraling rapidly out of control. Whatever was happening at Privet Drive, it required immediate investigation, but he was not the first magical person to detect the disturbance. Hermione felt the ward fluctuations as a sickening lurch in her magical senses, a wrongness that cut through her awareness like fingernails on a blackboard. She had been preparing for another time-turner journey when the protective magic around Harry suddenly spiked and wavered, sending alarm signals through every monitoring charm she had quietly placed around Little Whinging. Something was very wrong. She apparated to Privet Drive without hesitation, materializing in the back garden, with her heart racing and her wand already in her hand. The house looked normal from the outside, neat and suburban and utterly ordinary, but the magical atmosphere around it hummed with the kind of chaotic energy that spoke of recent magical violence. Hermione crept closer to the house, using every concealment charm she could remember to avoid detection by both magical and mundane surveillance. Through the shattered remains of the kitchen window, she could see the aftermath of Harry's accidental magic display. Glass everywhere, furniture overturned, and in the middle of it all, a small figure huddled in the corner with his arms wrapped around his knees. Harry, even from her hiding spot in the garden, Hermione could see that he was hurt. There was blood on his face from flying glass, his clothes were torn, and he was holding his left arm against his chest in a way that suggested injury. But worse than the physical damage was the expression on his face, a combination of fear, guilt, and desperate hopelessness that belonged on the face of someone far older than 7. The sight of him like that, small and wounded, and completely alone, sent a surge of protective fury through Hermione's chest that was so strong it nearly overwhelmed her ability to think rationally. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to march through the front door, hex the Dursleys into next week, and take Harry somewhere safe where no one would ever hurt him again. But she couldn't. The blood protection magic that surrounded the house would prevent her from removing Harry, and any direct confrontation with his relatives would expose her presence to Ministry investigators who were already looking for unauthorized magical interference around Harry Potter. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She waited until the house fell silent and the Dursleys retreated to their bedroom, then used a careful disillusionment charm to slip through the broken window and make her way to where Harry sat in the corner of the destroyed kitchen. "Harry," she whispered as she knelt beside him, her voice barely audible over the sound of glass crunching under her knees. "It's me." It's Hermione. Harry's head jerked up at the sound of her voice, and the relief that flooded his face was so profound that Hermione felt her chest tighten with emotion. Hermione, he breathed, reaching for her with his uninjured arm. I didn't mean to. I didn't know I could. There was so much glass. Shh, Hermione soothed, pulling him carefully into her arms and trying not to wince at the way he favored his left side. It's not your fault. You were protecting yourself. That's what magic does when we're frightened or angry. It tries to keep us safe. I told them the truth, Harry said quietly, his voice muffled against her shoulder. About my parents, about what really happened. And they got so angry, and my uncle was going to hit me, and I wanted them to stop. I wanted them to stop saying my parents were freaks and drunkards and that I was a burden. The quiet dignity with which he recounted the events made Hermione's heart ache with protective fury. Here was a 7-year-old child who had been punished for defending the memory of his dead parents, who had been hurt for refusing to accept lies about his own heritage. You did nothing wrong, she said fiercely. Do you understand me? Speaking the truth about your family is never wrong, no matter what anyone else says. Harry was quiet for a moment, absorbing this reassurance with the careful attention he brought to all of Hermione's declarations about his worth. Hermione, he said finally, his voice small and tired, can you take me away from here? I know you said the magic protection means I have to stay, but I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending to be something I'm not, and I can't keep living with people who hate everything about me. The simple, heartbroken request hit Hermione like a physical blow. She looked down at Harry, 7 years old and bleeding in her arms, asking to be rescued from the people who were supposed to care for him, and felt the terrible weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. Harry, she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. If I could take you away from here safely, I would do it in a heartbeat. But the magic that protects you, it only works while you live with your mother's family. If I removed you from this house, you would be vulnerable to the same dark wizards who killed your parents. They're dead, Harry said quietly. The dark wizards. You told me Voldemort was destroyed when he tried to kill me. Voldemort was destroyed, Hermione confirmed, but his followers weren't. Some of them are in prison, but others are still free, and they would love nothing more than to hurt the child who defeated their master. Harry processed this information with the serious consideration it deserved, but Hermione could see the despair in his green eyes as he began to understand the full scope of his situation. So I'm trapped, he said, with the flat acceptance of someone who had just realized that all the doors were locked and there was no way out. I have to stay here and let them hurt me and hate me and call my parents freaks, because leaving would mean dying. The stark accuracy of his summary made Hermione's throat tight with unshed tears. She wanted to argue with him, to find some way to make the situation sound less hopeless, but looking at his small, serious face, she realized that Harry deserved better than false comfort. For now, she said honestly, but not forever. When you turn 11, you'll go to Hogwarts, and you'll only have to come back here during holidays. And when you're 17 and legally an adult, you can leave forever and never come back. 10 more years, Harry said quietly, doing the math with the grim efficiency of someone calculating a prison sentence. 10 more years, Hermione confirmed, and the words felt like lead in her mouth. Harry was quiet for a long moment, staring at the destruction around them with the expression of someone coming to terms with an impossible situation. I made it worse, didn't I? He asked finally. When I started standing up for myself and asking questions about my parents, I made them angrier. Hermione felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach as she realized the truth that Harry had stumbled upon with devastating accuracy. "Oh, Harry," she whispered, pulling him closer as the full scope of what she had done began to settle around her like a suffocating blanket. She had given him truth, but truth without the power to change his circumstances had only made those circumstances more painful to bear. She had given him pride in his heritage, but pride that couldn't protect him from the people who hated that heritage. She had given him knowledge of his parents, love and sacrifice, but that knowledge only made the Dursleys' cruelty feel more unfair and more unbearable. Most damaging of all, she had given him the confidence to resist his treatment, but resistance without the ability to escape had only escalated the violence directed against him. "I thought I was helping you," Hermione said quietly, more to herself than to Harry. "I thought knowing the truth would make you stronger, but all I did was paint a target on your back and make you less willing to keep your head down and stay safe." "You were helping," Harry said with startling firmness, lifting his head to look at her directly. "Even if it made things harder, even if it made them angrier, I'm glad I know the truth. I'm glad I know my parents were heroes. I'm glad I know I'm not a freak or a burden or a mistake." The quiet conviction in his voice made Hermione's chest ache with a combination of pride and grief. "But you're hurt," she said, touching the cut on his cheek with gentle fingers. "And you're going to keep getting hurt until—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Harry understood anyway. "Until I learn to be quiet again," he said, with the resignation of someone who had just figured out the rules of a game he didn't want to play. "Until I stop asking questions, and stop defending my parents, and stop doing anything that reminds them that I'm magical." The matter-of-fact way he laid out his options made Hermione's heart break all over again. Here was a 7-year-old child calmly discussing the necessity of suppressing everything that made him who he was in order to survive the people who were supposed to love him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I'm so sorry, Harry. I wanted to help you, but all I did was make everything worse." Harry was quiet for a moment, then reached up with his good hand to touch her face with the gentle concern of someone far older than his 7 years. "You didn't make it worse," he said softly. "You made it different. Maybe harder, but also better in some ways. Because now I know who I really am, even if I have to hide it. And I know that somewhere out there are people who think magic is wonderful instead of freakish. And I know that in 4 years, I get to go somewhere where being magical is normal." The simple grace with which he offered her forgiveness made Hermione's eyes burn with tears she couldn't shed. "You're extraordinary," she told him, echoing the words she had spoken weeks ago in a park that felt like a lifetime away. "No matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you, you are absolutely extraordinary." As the time turner began its familiar pull and the magical instability around Privet Drive settled back into its normal patterns, Hermione held Harry Potter close and tried to memorize the feeling of his small arms around her neck and his whispered promise that he would remember everything she had taught him about being proud of who he was. She had set out to save him. Instead, she had learned the terrible truth about good intentions and unintended consequences, about the difference between helping someone and making their life easier. Some gifts, she realized as the world dissolved around her, were heavier to carry than they appeared. Hermione found Remus Lupin in a dingy flat above a Muggle bookshop in Cardiff, 3 days after the kitchen incident at Privet Drive had left her questioning every decision she had made since first turning the time turner. The address had taken considerable research to locate. Werewolves did not advertise their whereabouts, and unemployed ones had a tendency to move frequently to avoid the persistent discrimination that followed them like shadows. The building was old and poorly maintained, with peeling paint and windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. When Hermione knocked on the door of flat 4B, she heard the sound of hurried footsteps and what might have been books being hastily hidden away, as though the inhabitant was accustomed to unexpected visitors bringing bad news. The man who answered the door bore only a passing resemblance to the confident, respected Professor Lupin she knew from her original timeline. At 27, Remus was gaunt in a way that spoke of more than just the monthly toll of lycanthropy. This was the hollow-cheeked exhaustion of someone who had been struggling to find work and maintain basic necessities for years. His sandy hair was longer than she remembered, falling across his face in a way that might have been stylish if it hadn't so obviously been the result of not being able to afford regular haircuts. His clothes were clean, but worn, patched in several places with the careful attention of someone who had to make everything last. But his eyes were the same, amber-brown and intelligent, though shadowed now with the particular weariness that came from existing on the margins of a society that feared what he was. "Can I help you?" Lupin asked politely, though Hermione could see him assessing her with the careful attention of someone who had learned to watch for signs of hostility or recognition. "If you're looking for the bookshop, the entrance is around the corner." "Professor Lupin," Hermione said carefully, watching his expression change at the title he had not yet earned. "My name is Hermione Granger. I need to speak with you about Harry Potter." The transformation in Lupin's face was immediate and heartbreaking. The polite wariness disappeared, replaced by a combination of hope, guilt, and desperate hunger for information that made Hermione's chest ache with sympathy. "Harry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Is he all right? Has something happened to him?" "May I come in?" Hermione asked gently. "What I need to tell you is complicated and private." Lupin stepped back immediately, ushering her into a small sitting room that was clearly the domain of someone who owned more books than furniture. The space was cramped but clean, with carefully organized stacks of texts on defense against the dark arts, ancient runes, and werewolf legislation taking up every available surface. A small table by the window held what appeared to be correspondence about job applications, all bearing the polite but final language of rejection. "Please sit," Lupin said, clearing a space on the threadbare sofa with the quick movements of someone unused to entertaining guests. "Would you like tea? I'm afraid I don't have much to offer, but—" "Tea would be lovely," Hermione said, as much to give him something to do with his nervous energy as because she wanted it. As Lupin busied himself in the tiny kitchenette, Hermione looked around the flat and felt her heart break a little more at the evidence of how completely the wizarding world had failed the people who had fought for it. Here was a man who had been one of the most gifted students of his generation at Hogwarts, who had fought bravely for the Order of the Phoenix, who had lost his closest friends to war and betrayal, and who was now living in poverty because an accident of birth had made him unemployable in magical society. "You said your name was Granger," Lupin said, as he returned with 2 mismatched cups of tea that steamed with surprising warmth and richness. "I don't recognize the name from Hogwarts. Are you new to the magical world?" "In a sense," Hermione said carefully. "Remus. May I call you Remus? What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen to all of it before you decide whether or not to believe me." Lupin settled into the chair across from her, with the patient attention of someone who had learned that impossible things had a way of happening around magical children. "I'm listening," he said simply. "I'm from the future," Hermione said, deciding that directness was the only approach that would work. Specifically from 1998. I've been using advanced time-turner magic to travel back to 1987 to try to help Harry Potter during his childhood. The silence that followed this statement stretched for nearly a minute as Lupin processed what she had said. His expression cycled through disbelief, consideration, and finally a careful neutrality that suggested he was willing to listen to evidence before making a judgment. Time-turner magic, he said slowly. That's highly regulated. And dangerous. The longest possible journey I'm aware of is 5 hours. The time-turners the Ministry issues to students are limited to 5 hours, Hermione confirmed. The devices used for serious temporal research have fewer restrictions, though they're heavily guarded and their use is strictly controlled. And you have access to such a device? Lupin asked, his professor instincts clearly engaged despite his surprise. I do, Hermione said, though not through entirely official channels. I see. Lupin was quiet for a moment, studying her face with the sharp intelligence that had made him such an effective teacher. You said you've been visiting Harry in 1987. That would make him 7 years old, Hermione confirmed, and living with his aunt and uncle at 4 Privet Drive in Little Whinging. Surrey. They hate magic, hate him for being magical, and... She paused, struggling to find words that would convey the full scope of Harry's situation, without overwhelming Lupin with details he might not be ready to hear. He's not well cared for, Remus. They treat him like a burden at best, and actively abuse him at worst. The cup in Lupin's hands began to shake, tea sloshing dangerously close to the rim as fury and guilt warred in his expression. Abuse, he repeated, his voice flat and dangerous, in a way that reminded Hermione that for all his gentleness, Remus Lupin was still a predator once a month. You're telling me that James and Lily's son is being abused by the people who were supposed to protect him? Yes, Hermione said quietly. And where, Lupin continued with deadly calm, is Albus Dumbledore while this is happening? Where is the Order? Where are the people who swore to protect Harry if anything happened to James and Lily? That's part of why I'm here, Hermione said, because I've learned that the situation is far more complicated than I initially understood, and I need help from someone who knew James and Lily personally, someone who understands the magical protections involved. Lupin set down his teacup with deliberate care, as though he were afraid of what he might do if his hands weren't occupied. Tell me, he said simply. Over the next hour, Hermione explained everything. Her initial discovery of Harry's situation, her attempts to provide him with magical education and emotional support, the growing complications with Ministry surveillance, and finally the devastating realization that her intervention had made Harry's immediate circumstances worse rather than better. Lupin listened in absolute silence, his expression growing more pained with each detail of Harry's isolation and mistreatment. When Hermione described Harry's desperate plea to be taken away from Privet Drive, she saw tears gathering in his amber eyes. My God, he whispered when she finished. That poor child. James and Lily would be horrified to know what their son has endured. I thought the solution was simple, Hermione said, her own voice thick with emotion. I thought I could just remove him from the Dursleys and place him with a loving, magical family. But when I tried to research the blood protection magic that keeps him safe, you discovered that it requires him to live with his mother's blood relatives, Lupin finished grimly. The same magic that saved him from Voldemort only works as long as he can call the Dursleys' house home. Exactly, Hermione said. And more than that, I've come to understand that the threat to Harry didn't end when Voldemort was destroyed. There are still Death Eaters who escaped Azkaban, who would love nothing more than to hurt or kill the child who destroyed their master. Lupin's expression darkened further as he processed the implications. Lucius Malfoy, he said, with obvious distaste. Among others. Yes, you're right. Many of Voldemort's followers claimed to have been acting under the Imperius Curse when the Ministry rounded up Death Eaters after the war. Some of those claims were convenient rather than truthful. So Harry is protected from magical threats by the Blood Wards, Hermione said, working through the logic that had been keeping her awake at night. But only as long as he remains with people who make his daily life a misery. It's a protection that comes at the cost of his emotional well-being and psychological development. A terrible choice, Lupin agreed quietly. But perhaps a necessary one. The wizarding world is not kind to orphaned children, even famous ones. If Harry had been placed with a magical family, he would have grown up in the spotlight, constantly watched and scrutinized and expected to live up to impossible standards. The pressure alone might have destroyed him. You sound like you're defending Dumbledore's decision, Hermione said, unable to keep the accusation out of her voice. I'm not defending it, Lupin said carefully. I'm trying to understand it. Albus is many things, but he is not cruel. If he placed Harry with the Dursleys despite knowing they would not love him, he must have believed it was the least harmful of several terrible options. Hermione was quiet for a moment, absorbing this perspective. In her original timeline, she had grown up admiring Dumbledore's wisdom and compassion, but her visits to young Harry had made her question whether the legendary headmaster was as infallible as she had believed. Remus, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If you had known what Harry's childhood would be like with the Dursleys, would you have fought to take custody of him yourself? The pain that crossed Lupin's face at this question was so profound that Hermione immediately regretted asking it. Every day, he said quietly, every single day since James and Lily died, I've wondered if I should have tried to claim him. I was James's friend, Lily's friend. I loved that boy before he was even born. Then why didn't you? Hermione asked gently. Lupin gestured to the shabby flat around them, to the rejection letters on his table, to the careful patches in his clothes. Look at me, he said with bitter self-awareness. I'm a werewolf, Hermione. I can't hold steady employment, can't maintain a normal relationship, can barely afford to feed myself. Once a month, I become a dangerous creature that would pose a threat to any child in my care. What court would grant custody to someone like me? What magical authority would trust a werewolf to raise the most famous child in our world? But you would have loved him, Hermione said softly. Love doesn't keep children safe, Lupin replied, though his voice broke on the words. Love doesn't pay for food or clothes or medical care. Love doesn't protect a 7-year-old boy from the kind of people who would hurt him to get revenge on his parents. So you think Dumbledore made the right choice? Hermione asked. Lupin was silent for a long moment, staring into his teacup as though it contained answers to questions that had no good solutions. I think Dumbledore made the only choice he could live with, he said finally. Whether it was right, I suppose we'll never know. But Hermione, what you're describing, your attempts to help Harry, the complications you've created, they suggest that there might not be a right choice here, only different kinds of wrong ones. The brutal honesty of his assessment hit Hermione like a physical blow, because she was beginning to suspect he was right. So what do I do? She asked, hating the note of desperation she heard in her own voice. How do I help him when every action I take seems to make his situation worse? Lupin leaned forward in his chair, his expression gentling as he focused on her distress rather than his own guilt and regret. "You care about him," he said simply. "That's more than most adults in his life can say. But Hermione, you're trying to solve a problem that took years to create, and will take years to resolve. Harry's situation isn't something that can be fixed with good intentions and a time-turner." "Then what can fix it?" Hermione asked. "Time," Lupin said quietly. "Patience, and the knowledge that someone out there cares enough about him to risk everything trying to help, even when help seems impossible." "That's not enough," Hermione said fiercely. "He's 7 years old and he's suffering right now, today, while we sit here discussing magical theory and protective wards. He goes to sleep every night believing he's unwanted and unloved, and that his parents were the worthless drunks his aunt and uncle claim they were." "Then tell him the truth," Lupin said with sudden intensity. "If you can't remove him from the Dursleys, if you can't change his living situation, at least give him the knowledge of who his parents really were. Tell him about James's loyalty and Lily's brilliance and the way they died protecting him. Give him that much, even if you can't give him anything else." "I have been telling him," Hermione said. "But knowledge without hope is just another kind of burden. What good does it do for him to know his parents were heroes if he still has to go home every night to people who hate him for existing?" Lupin was quiet for a long moment, processing the impossible complexity of the situation they were discussing. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I wish I did. I wish there was some magical solution that would let us rescue him without putting him in greater danger. But Hermione, sometimes the best we can do is bear witness. Sometimes the most important thing we can offer is the knowledge that someone sees what's happening and cares enough to remember it." As Hermione prepared to leave Lupin's flat an hour later, she felt the weight of adult perspective settling around her like a suffocating blanket. She had come here hoping for solutions, for some insight that would show her how to fix Harry's situation without creating new problems. Instead, she had learned that the adults who should have been protecting Harry had been paralyzed by the same impossible choices that were now tormenting her. They had chosen safety over happiness, survival over love, strategic necessity over emotional well-being. And somewhere in Surrey, a 7-year-old boy was paying the price for their adult wisdom and careful calculations. "Hermione," Lupin said as she reached the door, his voice soft but urgent. "When you see Harry again, will you tell him that his father's friend remembers him? That someone who loved James and Lily is thinking about him and hoping he's all right?" "I will," Hermione promised, though the words felt like glass in her throat. As she disapparated from Cardiff back to her own timeline, Hermione carried with her the terrible understanding that some problems had no good solutions, only degrees of harm that had to be weighed and measured and chosen between. But she also carried the memory of Remus Lupin's tears when he spoke about the boy he had been unable to save, and the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, love could persist in ways that mattered more than she had ever realized. The letter arrived at the Tonks household on a grey December morning, delivered by an ordinary tawny owl that perched on the windowsill of their modest cottage in the Welsh countryside, as though it had every right to be there. Andromeda Tonks looked up from her morning tea with the mild curiosity of someone who rarely received unexpected correspondence, her dark hair still touched with sleep, and her expression carrying the particular serenity of a witch who had learned to find contentment in quiet domesticity. At 34, Andromeda bore the unmistakable black family features, the aristocratic bone structure, the intelligent dark eyes, the natural elegance that spoke of generations of careful breeding. But time and exile from her birth family had softened these inherited sharpnesses into something warmer, more approachable. Where her sisters Bellatrix and Narcissa had maintained the cold beauty of their noble bloodline, Andromeda had allowed herself to become simply pretty in the way that kind women often were. "Mum," called a voice from upstairs, young and cheerful, and completely at odds with the December gloom. "There's an owl at the window, and it's got a letter with our name on it." Andromeda Tonks appeared at the top of the stairs, with the easy grace of a 13-year-old who had spent the morning experimenting with her appearance. Today, her hair was a shocking pink that caught the pale winter light streaming through the cottage windows, and her eyes had shifted from their natural dark brown to a bright violet that matched her current mood. She bounded down the stairs with characteristic energy, her metamorph magus abilities allowing her to express her personality in ways that conventional teenagers could only dream of. "Who do you think it's from?" Nymphadora asked, settling at the kitchen table with the kind of casual intimacy that belonged to households where parent and child genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "We never get letters during the holidays except from Hogwarts, and those are usually telling me off for something." Andromeda smiled at her daughter's theatrical guilt, knowing perfectly well that Nymphadora's infractions at school were more about high spirits than actual malice. She opened the letter with careful fingers, noting immediately that the parchment was of good quality, and the handwriting belonged to someone educated but unfamiliar. What she read made her blood run cold with a combination of recognition and protective fury. "Dear Mrs. Tonks, you do not know me, but I am writing to you about a matter that concerns both our families in ways that may not be immediately apparent. Your cousin Sirius Black, currently imprisoned in Azkaban, was the godfather of Harry Potter, James Potter's son, who survived the attack that killed his parents in 1981. I have recently learned that Harry is not being properly cared for by his Muggle guardians, and that the magical world has largely forgotten about him in favor of celebrating what his survival represented, rather than ensuring his welfare. I believe that those of us who knew his parents, or who are connected to the people who loved him, have a responsibility to ensure that he does not grow up believing himself unloved or unwanted. If you would be willing to meet with me to discuss ways we might help Harry while respecting the protective magic that requires him to remain with his mother's relatives, I would be most grateful. I can be reached through the leaky cauldron, where Tom the innkeeper will forward messages. I hope you will consider this request. Harry Potter deserves to know that there are people who remember his parents with love and who care about his happiness. Sincerely, H. Granger Andromeda read the letter twice, her heart beating faster with each line as old guilt and fresh determination warred in her chest. She had tried, in the years since Sirius's imprisonment, not to think too much about her disowned cousin or the choices that had led to his downfall. It was easier to focus on the life she had built with Ted and Nymphadora, easier to pretend that the Black family tragedies were someone else's burden to bear. But Harry Potter, the child of Lily and James Potter, the boy who had survived Voldemort's attack, who was supposedly safe and cared for somewhere in the Muggle world, that was different. That was a responsibility she couldn't ignore, no matter how much distance she had tried to put between herself and the magical world's politics. "Mum," Nymphadora said quietly, her hair shifting to a worried brown as she noticed her mother's expression. "Is everything all right? You look like someone's died." "Not died," Andromeda said slowly, folding the letter with careful precision. "But, Nymphadora, what do you know about Harry Potter?" Nymphadora's eyes widened with surprise, and her hair flickered through several colors before settling on an interested blue. "Harry Potter, the boy who lived? Everyone knows about him, Mum. He's the one who defeated you-know-who when he was just a baby. Why are you asking about him? Do you know where he is now? Andromeda pressed. What happened to him after his parents died? No one really talks about that, Nymphadora said with a frown. I mean, everyone assumes he's somewhere safe, being raised by magical guardians or something. The professors at Hogwarts sometimes mention him when they're talking about the war, but always like he's this legend, not a real person. Why? Andromeda made a decision that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. Because, she said, smoothing the letter against the kitchen table, it seems that the real Harry Potter is not a legend at all. He's just a 7-year-old boy who needs help, and someone thinks we might be able to provide it. The meeting took place 3 days later in a private room at the Leaky Cauldron, where Hermione had arrived early to claim a corner table far from the main bustle of the pub. She had spent considerable time deciding how to present herself for this encounter. Too young and she would not be taken seriously. Too old and she might inspire suspicion about how a teenager had gained access to such sensitive information. When Andromeda Tonks entered the room, Hermione felt her breath catch with recognition. The resemblance to her sisters was unmistakable. But where Bellatrix had possessed a wild, dangerous beauty, and Narcissa maintained an icy perfection, Andromeda radiated the kind of warm intelligence that belonged to women who had chosen love over status and found themselves happier for the decision. Miss Granger? Andromeda asked, settling into the chair across from Hermione, with the natural grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. Thank you for reaching out. I've been thinking about your letter since I received it, and I have to admit I'm both intrigued and concerned. Thank you for coming, Hermione said, choosing her words carefully. I know what I've written must sound strange, but I need you to understand that everything I've told you about Harry Potter's situation is true. He's not being cared for properly, and the people responsible for his placement seem to believe that physical safety is sufficient, regardless of his emotional welfare. You mentioned in your letter that those of us connected to people who loved Harry have a responsibility, Andromeda said thoughtfully. What makes you think I have any connection to Harry Potter at all? Your cousin Sirius Black was Harry's godfather, Hermione said simply. Before his imprisonment, he was meant to be Harry's guardian if anything happened to James and Lily. The magical world failed Sirius just as completely as it's failing Harry. An innocent man sent to prison without a trial, a child placed with relatives who despise everything he represents. Andromeda's face went very still, and for a moment Hermione could see the Black family pride and temper that had been bred into her bones. Sirius is innocent? She asked quietly. Completely, Hermione confirmed. The real traitor was Peter Pettigrew, who is still alive and hiding while your cousin serves a life sentence for crimes he didn't commit. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Andromeda stared down at her hands, and Hermione could see her processing not just the information, but the implications, that her family had lost another member to injustice, that the wizarding world's celebrated victory over Voldemort had been built on lies and false convictions. How do you know this? Andromeda asked finally. I can't tell you that, Hermione said honestly. But I can tell you that Harry Potter is currently living with his mother's sister and her husband in Surrey, where he sleeps in a cupboard under the stairs, and is told daily that his parents were drunken wastrels who died in a car crash. He's never celebrated a birthday, never received a Christmas present, never been hugged or told he's loved. And in 4 years, when his Hogwarts letter arrives, he'll discover that he's famous throughout the magical world while having no idea why. Andromeda's expression went through a complicated series of changes: shock, fury, and finally a grim determination that reminded Hermione strongly of the woman's daughter. "What are you proposing we do about it?" she asked. "I'm proposing," Hermione said carefully, "that we create a network of people who care about Harry's welfare and who are willing to work together to provide him with the love and support he needs, even if we can't remove him from his current situation." "A network," Andromeda repeated thoughtfully. "People who remember his parents, people who understand what he's lost, people who can ensure he receives the kind of care and attention that should have been provided all along. Anonymous gifts, occasional visits from strangers who happen to be in his neighborhood, small acts of kindness that let him know he's not forgotten." "And you think my daughter and I could help with this?" Andromeda asked. "Nymphadora is a metamorphmagus," Hermione said. "She could approach Harry without being recognized, could check on his welfare, could provide him with magical companionship without raising suspicion from his guardians or the ministry officials who monitor him." "You want my 13-year-old daughter to become involved in unauthorized magical surveillance?" Andromeda said dryly. "I want your 13-year-old daughter to help another child who desperately needs to know that magical people exist who care about his happiness," Hermione corrected. "This isn't about spying or surveillance. It's about making sure a lonely little boy knows he's not alone." Andromeda was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal with the careful attention it deserved. "If we did this," she said finally, "if we agreed to help, what safeguards would be in place? What protections for Harry, for my daughter, for everyone involved?" "Complete anonymity," Hermione said immediately. "No direct contact with Harry's guardians, no interference with the protective magic surrounding him, no actions that could be traced back to specific individuals. We would work around the restrictions, not against them." "And if the ministry discovered what we were doing?" "Caring about a child's welfare isn't illegal," Hermione said. "Sending anonymous gifts, making charitable donations, happening to be in the same public spaces, none of that violates any magical laws or endangers the blood protection that keeps Harry safe." "But it would certainly violate the spirit of the isolation that was imposed on him," Andromeda observed. "The isolation was meant to keep him safe, not to keep him miserable," Hermione replied. "If we can provide him with emotional support without compromising his physical security, then we're fulfilling the true purpose of his placement while addressing the failures of its implementation." When Andromeda finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet determination of someone who had made a decision that would define her character for years to come. "I'll help," she said simply. "Not just because of Sirius, though that's part of it. Not just because of the injustice to Harry, though that matters too. But because I know what it feels like to be cut off from the people who should love you. And I wouldn't wish that isolation on any child." "Thank you," Hermione said, feeling something tight in her chest finally ease. "And Nymphadora?" "We'll be thrilled to be part of something this dramatic and important," Andromeda said, with the slight smile of a mother who knew her daughter very well. She's been complaining for months about how boring her holidays have become since she started at Hogwarts. This will give her something meaningful to focus on. Over the following weeks, the network that Hermione had proposed began to take shape with surprising speed and efficiency. Andromeda proved to be not just willing, but exceptionally capable at organizing covert charitable operations, bringing to the project the same methodical intelligence that had made her one of the most accomplished witches of her generation at Hogwarts. Through carefully worded letters and discreet conversations, she reached out to other magical families who had connections to the Potter legacy, former Order of the Phoenix members who had survived the war, Hogwarts classmates of James and Lily, who remembered their kindness, even some pure-blooded families who had lost children to Voldemort and understood the importance of protecting those who remained. The response was overwhelming. The Longbottoms, despite their current circumstances, arranged for regular anonymous deliveries of clothing and books to Harry's address through a Muggle courier service that had no idea they were handling magical charity. The Weasleys, who had met Harry briefly through Hermione's introduction, became enthusiastic participants in what Molly began referring to as the Potter Project, sending homemade treats and small gifts that appeared mysteriously on Harry's windowsill. Even some unexpected allies emerged. Professor McGonagall, who had been quietly monitoring Harry's situation for years, began leaving children's books about magical creatures in the little whinging library, carefully placed where an inquisitive 7-year-old might find them. Remus Lupin, who had been galvanized by Hermione's visit, started taking long walks through Harry's neighborhood, watching from a distance to ensure his safety, while wrestling with his own guilt over years of inaction. Nymphadora proved to be invaluable in ways that even Hermione hadn't anticipated. Her Metamorph Magus abilities allowed her to appear as different children of varying ages, letting her interact with Harry in playgrounds and parks without creating a suspicious pattern. She brought him news of the magical world framed as imaginative games and stories, teaching him about Quidditch as though it were something she had invented rather than something she played at Hogwarts. Most importantly, she provided him with genuine friendship from someone close to his own age, something he had never experienced and desperately needed. "He's so polite," Nymphadora reported to her mother after one of her visits, her hair a thoughtful purple that matched her mood. Like, unnaturally polite. He apologizes for everything, even when he hasn't done anything wrong. And he's so grateful for the smallest kindness that it makes my heart hurt. That's what happens to children who have been taught that their needs are burdens, Andromeda said quietly, remembering her own childhood in the Black family home, where affection was earned rather than freely given. They learn to expect nothing and to be grateful for scraps. "Well, he's getting more than scraps now," Nymphadora said with satisfaction. "The whole network is working exactly like Miss Granger hoped it would. Harry is receiving regular gifts. He has someone to talk to about magic, and he's starting to believe that maybe he's not as strange and unwanted as his relatives have taught him to believe." But even as the network expanded and Harry's situation improved, Hermione found herself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. She had succeeded in creating a support system for Harry that worked around the constraints of his placement, but she had also created something that existed outside normal, magical law and regulation. The people helping Harry were doing so in secret, without oversight, based entirely on their personal conviction that the wizarding world had failed a child who deserved better. It was vigilante charity, essentially, well-intentioned but unauthorized, effective but potentially dangerous if discovered by the wrong people. "What we're doing is working," she said to Andromeda during one of their regular meetings to coordinate the network's activities. "Harry is happier, more confident, better informed about his heritage. But I keep wondering what happens when he goes to Hogwarts and discovers that half his year-mates' families have been secretly involved in his childhood without his knowledge. Then he'll understand that he was loved even when he couldn't see it," Andromeda said simply. "And perhaps he'll be able to forgive us for not being able to love him more openly." "And what about the people we haven't told? What about Dumbledore, who placed Harry with the Dursleys specifically to keep him isolated from magical influence? What about the ministry officials who monitor his welfare and have no idea that dozens of magical families are circumventing their oversight?" "Some secrets," Andromeda said, with the calm certainty of someone who had spent her adult life navigating the complicated space between official policy and moral necessity are kept not because they're wrong, but because they're more right than the alternatives. As winter deepened and Harry's 8th birthday approached, Hermione realized that she had achieved something she hadn't originally intended. She had created a movement. What had started as her individual mission to help one lonely child had become a community effort involving dozens of families and spanning multiple generations of the magical world. Harry Potter was no longer an isolated, forgotten child. He was the secret project of a network of people who had decided that sometimes adult wisdom was less important than childhood happiness, that sometimes breaking rules was necessary to repair the damage those rules had caused. But with that success came new responsibilities and new dangers, because movements, once started, had a tendency to grow beyond their creator's control, and Hermione was beginning to understand that she had set in motion forces that might ultimately change far more than one little boy's childhood. The question was whether she had the wisdom to guide those forces toward outcomes that would help rather than harm the child she was trying so desperately to save. The time turner had begun to feel different in Hermione's hands, heavier somehow, as though the golden mechanism was growing tired from the strain of carrying her consciousness across 11 years of temporal distance, week after week. When she turned it for what she sensed would be one of her final trips to 1987, the familiar sensation of time reversing around her was accompanied by a discordant humming that made her magical senses ache with warning. Advanced temporal magic was never meant to be used this frequently, or across such significant spans of time. The delicate chronometer that had been crafted for serious research was showing signs of instability that spoke of approaching failure. Hairline cracks in the golden housing, a stutter in the smooth rotation of the inner mechanisms, and most concerning of all, an increasing reluctance to respond to her magical direction. She materialized in the alley behind King's Cross Station with less precision than usual, stumbling slightly as the temporal transition left her more disoriented than it should have. The time turner was warm against her chest, almost uncomfortably so, and she could feel the magical resonance it generated, pulsing irregularly like a heartbeat under stress. It was March of 1988 now, nearly 6 months since she had first written to Andromeda Tonks and set in motion the network of care that had transformed Harry Potter's childhood from one of complete isolation to something that resembled actual support. As Hermione made her way through the familiar streets of Little Whinging, she felt the weight of approaching endings settling around her like a shroud. This couldn't continue much longer. The Ministry investigators were closing in. She could sense the increased magical surveillance around Harry's neighborhood, the subtle monitoring charms that had been placed on every apparition point within a 5-mile radius of Privet Drive. More than that, her own time turner was approaching the limits of its capability, and she was beginning to understand that some interventions were meant to be temporary by their very nature. But as she settled onto her usual swing in the small park where she had been meeting Harry for months, Hermione was struck by how much had changed since that first desperate encounter. The 8-year-old boy who approached her now bore little resemblance to the broken, terrified child she had found a year ago. Harry moved with confidence now, his small shoulders held straight instead of hunched in permanent expectation of punishment. His clothes, while still hand-me-downs from his cousin, were clean and properly fitted, evidence of the anonymous donations that had been quietly supplementing the Dursleys' grudging provision for his basic needs. Most importantly, his green eyes held a spark of curiosity and hope that had been completely absent during their first meeting. "Hermione!" Harry called out as he ran toward her, his face breaking into the kind of genuine smile that belonged to children who expected good things to happen to them. "I was hoping you'd come today. Dora said she might not be able to visit this week because of school, and I wanted to tell someone about what happened yesterday." The casual mention of Nymphadora, Dora to Harry, one of several rotating magical companions who had become part of his regular social circle, filled Hermione with a complicated mixture of pride and melancholy. Her mission had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, but its very success meant that she was no longer essential to Harry's well-being in the way she once had been. "Tell me everything," Hermione said, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of old friendship. "My cousin Dudley was being awful yesterday," Harry began, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting unfortunate weather rather than family trauma. "He was trying to break my books again, the ones that keep appearing in my room. But this time, instead of just hiding them, something strange happened." Hermione felt her pulse quicken with alarm. "Strange how?" "All the books just floated away from him," Harry said, with obvious fascination rather than fear. "Like they were flying, but not with wings. They went right up to the ceiling and stayed there until he gave up trying to reach them. Then they came back down and arranged themselves all neat and tidy on my shelf." The description of controlled magical levitation from an 8-year-old made Hermione's breath catch. This wasn't accidental magic, the chaotic, emotionally driven bursts of power that all magical children occasionally displayed. This was purposeful, if unconscious, spell work of a sophistication that shouldn't have been possible for someone Harry's age. "How did you feel when it happened?" Hermione asked carefully. "Calm," Harry said immediately. "That's the strange part. Usually when Dudley tries to break my things, I get angry and upset, and then weird things happen that make my aunt and uncle furious with me. But yesterday I just knew the books would be safe, like I was protecting them instead of just having an accident." "And your aunt and uncle? Did they see what happened?" "Uncle Vernon was at work and Aunt Petunia was in the garden," Harry said. "But even if they had seen, I don't think they would have been as angry as usual. They've been different lately, less likely to shout at me for things that aren't really my fault." Hermione nodded, recognizing the subtle influence of the network that had been carefully pressuring the Dursleys to improve their treatment of Harry. Anonymous letters expressing concern about neighborhood children's welfare, unexpected visits from social services prompted by concerned citizen reports, and occasional gifts for Harry that arrived with polite but firm notes suggesting that young children deserved kindness rather than hostility. The Dursleys remained unloving guardians, but they were no longer actively abusive ones, a compromise that felt insufficient to Hermione's protective instincts, but represented significant progress from Harry's perspective. "Harry," Hermione said gently, recognizing that the conversation they needed to have could no longer be postponed. "I need to tell you something important about our friendship and about what might happen in the future." Harry's expression immediately became serious, his intuitive understanding of adult conversation telling him that something significant was about to change. "You have to go away, don't you?" he asked quietly. "Like how my parents had to go away, except not forever." The simple accuracy of his perception hit Hermione like a physical blow. Somewhere over the course of their year-long friendship, Harry had developed the emotional intelligence to recognize when adults were preparing to leave him, but also the confidence to believe that not all departures were permanent. "Yes," she said honestly. "I have to return to where I came from. The magic that lets me visit you, it's not meant to work forever, and it's becoming dangerous for me to keep using it." "Because of the ministry people who have been watching the neighborhood?" Harry asked, with the sharp insight that never failed to amaze her. "Dora told me there were official wizards trying to figure out why so many magical people have been coming to Little Whinging. She said it was making some important people nervous." "Dora is right," Hermione confirmed. "But Harry, I need you to understand something very important. even though I have to leave, the other people who care about you aren't going anywhere. The friends you've made, the families who send you gifts, the people who check on your welfare, they're all going to keep being part of your life. Because I'm not alone anymore, Harry said with quiet conviction. Not like I was before you came. Even when I can't see the people who care about me, I know they're there. Exactly, Hermione said, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes, at his mature acceptance of circumstances he couldn't control. And in a few years, when you get your Hogwarts letter, you'll discover that many of the people who have been helping you are parents and siblings and relatives of your future classmates. You'll go to school already, knowing that you have a community waiting for you. Harry was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the serious consideration he brought to all discussions of his magical future. Hermione, he said finally, will you tell me your real name before you go? I know Hermione isn't the name you were born with, because Dora looked it up in the Hogwarts records and couldn't find anyone with that name who would be the right age to know so much about magic. The question caught Hermione completely off guard. In all her careful planning and preparation, she had somehow failed to anticipate that an intelligent child with access to magical friends would eventually investigate inconsistencies in her cover story. How long have you known? She asked. Since Christmas, Harry said. Dora didn't mean to make me suspicious, but when she couldn't find you in the school records, I started thinking about all the things you know that seem like they come from the future instead of the past. Like how you always know exactly what I need to hear, or how you never seem surprised by things that happen around me. Hermione felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March weather. If Harry had figured out that she wasn't who she claimed to be, what else might he have deduced about her true origins? My real name, she said carefully, is Hermione Granger. I didn't lie about that. But you're right that I'm not exactly who I've been pretending to be. Are you from the future? Harry asked, with the direct curiosity that characterized all his important questions. Is that why you know so much about what's going to happen to me? The simple honesty of the question deserved an equally honest answer, even though Hermione knew she was violating every protocol about temporal secrecy that had ever been established. Yes, she said quietly, I'm from your future, from a time when you're grown up and famous and happy. I came back because I wanted to help you have a better childhood than you were supposed to have. Harry absorbed this revelation with remarkable calm, as though the confirmation of time travel was just another interesting fact about the magical world he was learning to navigate. Did it work? He asked. Am I happier now than I was supposed to be? Much happier, Hermione said, thinking of the confident, curious boy sitting beside her, and comparing him to her memories of the terrified, isolated child she had first encountered. You're surrounded by people who care about you. You understand your magical heritage, and you know that your parents were heroes who loved you. Those are gifts that will stay with you for the rest of your life. Before Harry could respond, a new voice interrupted their conversation, cultured, dignified, and carrying the particular authority that belonged to wizards accustomed to being obeyed without question. Miss Granger, said Albus Dumbledore, as he approached their secluded corner of the park with the measured steps of someone who had been expecting this encounter for some time. I believe it's time we had a proper conversation. Harry's reaction to the stranger was immediate and telling. Instead of shrinking back in fear as he would have done a year ago, he moved slightly closer to Hermione in a gesture of protective solidarity, his young face set in lines of determined courage that reminded her strongly of his father. It's all right, Harry, Hermione said quickly. This is Professor Dumbledore. He's the headmaster of the magical school you'll attend when you're older. He's not going to hurt either of us." Dumbledore's blue eyes, bright behind his half-moon spectacles, moved between Hermione and Harry with the careful assessment of someone cataloguing changes and drawing conclusions about their significance. "Indeed," the elderly wizard said gently, settling onto a nearby bench with the kind of practiced grace that made even outdoor furniture seem like a throne. "I have no intention of causing harm to anyone here. I have simply come to understand the scope of the temporal intervention that has been taking place around young Harry, and I thought it prudent to discuss the implications with the person responsible." "You've known about me for a while, haven't you?" Hermione asked, recognizing in Dumbledore's manner the patience of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to reveal his awareness. "I have suspected for several months," Dumbledore confirmed. "The magical signatures around Harry's neighborhood, the subtle changes in his behavior and confidence, the mysterious appearance of support networks that seemed to operate with remarkable knowledge of his circumstances. All of it suggested intervention by someone with both considerable magical ability and intimate knowledge of Harry's situation." "And you didn't try to stop me," Hermione observed. "I saw no reason to stop something that was clearly benefiting Harry's welfare," Dumbledore said simply, "though I will admit to considerable curiosity about your origins and motivations." "I told you," Harry said suddenly, his voice carrying a fierce protectiveness that made both adults turn to look at him. "She came from the future to help me have a better childhood. And it worked. I'm not scared and lonely anymore because of her." Dumbledore's expression softened at Harry's passionate defense, and Hermione saw in his face the complex mixture of guilt and relief that belonged to someone who had made difficult decisions and discovered they had worked out better than expected. "I can see that," the headmaster said quietly. "The question now is what happens next. Miss Granger, I assume your time turner is approaching the limits of its operational capacity?" "It is," Hermione confirmed. "I probably have 1 or 2 more trips left before the temporal strain becomes too dangerous to risk." "And the Ministry investigators?" "Closing in," Hermione admitted. "I've been careful to avoid detection, but the repeated temporal incursions have left traces that can't be hidden indefinitely." Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully, his fingers steepled, as he considered options and implications with the focused attention of someone solving a particularly complex puzzle. "I propose," he said finally, "a compromise that serves everyone's interests. You complete your mission and return to your proper timeline. But the support network you've created around Harry continues under my oversight. The families who have been helping him remain involved in his welfare, but their activities are coordinated through official channels that won't trigger ministry investigation." "You'd sanction the network?" Hermione asked with surprise. "I would formalize it," Dumbledore corrected. "Harry clearly benefits from community support, and the people who have been providing it are motivated by genuine care for his well-being. Rather than dismantling something that works, it seems more logical to ensure its sustainability." Harry looked between the 2 adults with obvious hope. "Does that mean Dora can keep visiting me? And the Weasley family can keep sending me things? And I'll still get letters from people who knew my parents?" "All of that and more," Dumbledore promised, though perhaps with somewhat more discretion to avoid unwanted official attention. As the late afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the park, Hermione felt the weight of endings and beginnings settling around her like a cloak. Her mission was complete, but not in the way she had originally envisioned. She hadn't rescued Harry Potter from his circumstances. Instead, she had transformed those circumstances into something that could nurture rather than harm him. "There's one more thing," she said to Dumbledore, as Harry ran ahead of them toward the park's exit. When Harry comes to Hogwarts in 3 years, he's going to know more about the magical world than you're probably expecting. He's going to have friends and allies and people who care about him. Don't underestimate how much that will change everything about his school experience." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled with something that might have been anticipation. "Miss Granger," he said, "I rather suspect that will be a change for the better." As Hermione prepared to turn the time-turner for what would likely be her final journey back to 1998, she looked at Harry Potter, 8 years old, confident, surrounded by love he could finally recognize, and felt the deep satisfaction that belonged to missions accomplished and children saved. Some rescues, she had learned, didn't require removing someone from danger. Sometimes the best rescue was teaching them that they weren't in danger alone. The return to 1993 felt different from all the previous temporal transitions Hermione had experienced. Instead of the violent, wrenching sensation that had accompanied her journeys backward through time, this final turn of the time-turner carried her forward with something that felt almost like relief, as though time itself was exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. When the familiar surroundings of her third-year dormitory at Hogwarts solidified around her, Hermione immediately sensed that something fundamental had changed. The room looked the same. Her 4-poster bed with its red hangings, her overflowing bookshelf, the small mirror on her bedside table. But the quality of the air itself felt different, charged with possibilities that hadn't existed before her intervention. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited for the temporal disorientation to settle, but instead of the usual sharp clarity that followed time-turner usage, Hermione found herself experiencing something far more unsettling. Her memories were shifting. The original timeline, the one where Harry Potter had been a broken, isolated child who arrived at Hogwarts, friendless and traumatized, began to feel distant and insubstantial, like a half-remembered nightmare that loses its power in daylight. In its place, new memories were integrating themselves into her consciousness with the smooth inevitability of water filling an empty vessel. She remembered meeting Harry Potter on the Hogwarts Express for the first time and being struck by his easy confidence and genuine curiosity about magic. She remembered him laughing with Ron Weasley about shared childhood memories, stories about visits to the Burrow, about Nymphadora Tonks's amazing metamorph magus abilities, about the mysterious childhood friend named Hermione, who had taught him to love learning about the magical world. "That's impossible," Hermione whispered to herself, pressing her hands against her temples as the new memories continued to cascade through her consciousness. "I remember both timelines. I remember the changes I made." But even as she said it, she could feel her certainty beginning to waver. The Novikov self-consistency principle was asserting itself with inexorable logic. If she had traveled back in time to change Harry's childhood, then those changes had always been part of the timeline she inhabited. The broken, traumatized Harry Potter she remembered rescuing existed only in a timeline that could no longer exist, because her intervention had prevented it from ever occurring. A knock on her dormitory door interrupted her temporal vertigo, followed by the cheerful voice of Lavender Brown. "Hermione, Harry Potter's looking for you. He's down in the common room, and he says it's important." The words sent a jolt of electricity through Hermione's chest. Harry Potter was looking for her, not as a stranger who needed help, but as someone who apparently knew her well enough to seek her out, specifically. She made her way down to the Gryffindor common room, with the careful steps of someone navigating between two different sets of memories, unsure which version of reality would greet her when she arrived. The Harry Potter who looked up from his transfiguration homework as she approached bore only a passing resemblance to the broken child she remembered from her original timeline. At 13, He was still small for his age, but he carried himself with the natural confidence of someone who had never learned to make himself invisible. His dark hair was still untidy, but it was the comfortable untidiness of someone who had more important things to worry about than appearance, rather than the neglected shabbiness of a child whose basic needs went unmet. Most importantly, his green eyes held none of the haunted wariness that had characterized the original Harry Potter. These were the eyes of someone who expected good things to happen to them, who trusted that the adults around them generally had their best interests at heart. "Hermione," Harry said, his face breaking into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. "I was hoping I'd catch you before dinner. I wanted to thank you for the book you recommended about advanced transfiguration theory. McGonagall said my essay on the mathematical principles behind human-to-animal transformation was the best she's received from a third year in decades. The casual reference to academic excellence, delivered without anxiety or surprise, told Hermione everything she needed to know about how profoundly Harry's educational foundation had been changed by early intervention. This was a Harry Potter who had learned to love learning, who approached new magical concepts with enthusiasm rather than fear. "I'm glad it was helpful," Hermione managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears as she navigated between her memories of who Harry Potter was supposed to be and who he had apparently become. "You know," Harry said thoughtfully, settling back into his chair with the easy familiarity of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I was thinking about something you said when we were children, about how magic is most powerful when it connects people rather than separating them." Hermione felt her breath catch. She had said those words to 8-year-old Harry Potter in a park in Little Whinging 6 years ago. But in this timeline, they had become part of his foundational understanding of magic, rather than a desperate attempt to comfort a traumatized child. "I remember," she said carefully. "I've been thinking about it more lately, because of what happened with the Dementors at the Quidditch match," Harry continued. "When they attacked, the thing that saved me wasn't advanced magic or special training. It was thinking about all the people who care about me. You and Ron and the Weasleys, Andromeda and Nymphadora, even Remus Lupin, who I finally got to meet properly this year." The casual mention of the support network that had sustained him throughout his childhood made Hermione's chest tighten with emotion. In the original timeline, Harry's Patronus had been powered by the memory of parents he had never known and a happiness he had rarely experienced. In this timeline, he had an abundance of genuine connections and love to draw from. "Professor Lupin says I have an unusual talent for the Patronus charm," Harry said, with the quiet pride of someone who had learned that magical ability was something to be celebrated rather than feared. "He thinks it's because I've always understood that magic works best when it's rooted in love rather than power." "That sounds like something Professor Lupin would say," Hermione agreed, remembering her conversation with the werewolf in his shabby Cardiff flat, and how desperately he had wanted to be part of Harry's life. "He's been wonderful this year," Harry said enthusiastically. "I think having him as Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher has been good for both of us. He knew my parents, you know, and he's been able to tell me stories about them that I'd never heard before. About how my father learned to become an animagus to keep him company during his transformations. About how my mother once hexed Severus Snape for bullying a first year." The easy comfort with which Harry discussed his parents' legacy told Hermione that her early interventions had achieved their most important goal. Harry Potter had grown up knowing he was loved, and that his heritage was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. "Your parents sound like they were remarkable people," Hermione said, meaning it more than Harry could possibly understand. "They were," Harry agreed simply. "And I'm grateful I got to learn about them from people who actually knew and loved them, rather than just from history books and newspaper articles." As they talked, Other students filtered through the common room, and Hermione was struck by how naturally Harry interacted with them. He had friends, real friends, not just Ron and herself, but a wider circle of people who genuinely enjoyed his company and sought out his opinion on everything, from Quidditch strategy to defense against the dark arts homework. More importantly, Harry seemed to understand his own worth in a way that the original version never had. When younger students approached him for help with their studies, he responded with patient kindness rather than uncomfortable obligation. When his friends included him in their plans, he participated with enthusiastic engagement rather than grateful surprise. "Oh, before I forget," Harry said as the conversation began to wind down. "Molly Weasley sent me another care package yesterday. She included enough homemade fudge for half the tower, and she specifically mentioned that you should make sure to get some before Fred and George discover it." The mention of Molly Weasley's continued maternal attention made Hermione smile, despite her temporal confusion. In both timelines, Molly had taken Harry under her wing, but in this version, her care was part of a long-established pattern rather than a sudden adoption of a neglected child. "She's always been kind to you," Hermione observed. "The whole family has," Harry said with warm gratitude. "I don't know what my childhood would have been like without the Weasleys checking on me and making sure I knew I had a place where I was always welcome. Ron says his mother started knitting me sweaters before I could walk, which seems a bit excessive even for her." The casual reference to a childhood filled with surrogate family care made Hermione's throat tight with emotion. This was the Harry Potter she had dreamed of creating, confident, loved, secure in his place in the world. "Harry," she said carefully, "do you ever think about your childhood at the Dursleys? About how different your life might have been if—" "If what?" Harry asked, with genuine curiosity, rather than the haunted defensiveness that had characterized discussions of his childhood in the original timeline. "If you hadn't had so many people looking out for you," Hermione finished. Harry was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the serious attention he brought to all hypothetical discussions. "I suppose it would have been lonelier," he said finally. "The Dursleys were never going to love me. They're too afraid of magic and too resentful of having their lives disrupted. But knowing that I had friends and family who cared about me made it easier to tolerate their disapproval. It's hard to believe you're worthless when Andromeda Tonks is sending you birthday presents, and Molly Weasley is writing letters asking about your health and happiness." "You're right," Hermione said softly. "Community makes all the difference." As the evening wore on, and the common room gradually emptied, Hermione found herself marveling at the profound changes that had rippled outward from her simple intervention. Harry Potter was not just healthier and happier, he was fundamentally different in ways that would affect every relationship he formed and every challenge he faced. The scared, defensive child who had trusted no one and expected nothing had been replaced by a young man who approached the world with optimism and curiosity, who formed deep friendships easily and maintained them with genuine care, who understood magic as a tool for connection rather than a source of danger. When Harry finally gathered his books and headed toward the dormitory stairs, he paused to look back at Hermione with an expression of thoughtful gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. I know I don't remember all the details of how we became friends when we were children, but I know you've always been important to me. Having someone who believed in me before I even believed in myself, it made all the difference." As Harry disappeared up the stairs, Hermione felt the last of her original timeline memories fade into comfortable distance. The broken child she had set out to save no longer existed, had never existed in this reality, because her intervention had created something far better than rescue. She had created prevention. Instead of saving Harry Potter from trauma, she had ensured that the trauma never occurred. Instead of healing wounds, she had provided the community and love that prevented the wounds from forming in the first place. Hermione settled into her favorite armchair by the fire and opened her own transfiguration textbook. But her mind was focused on larger transformations than the ones McGonagall had assigned. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful magic wasn't about changing what existed, but about ensuring that better things existed to begin with. The time-turner around her neck felt warm against her skin, no longer humming with temporal energy, but resting quiet and satisfied against her chest like a job completed. She wouldn't need to use it again, couldn't use it again, even if she wanted to, because the timeline was now stable and self-consistent. Harry Potter was exactly where he was supposed to be, surrounded by love, confident in his magic, secure in his place in the world, and equipped with the emotional foundation he would need to face whatever challenges the future might bring. As the last flames flickered low in the common room fireplace, Hermione smiled and turned the page to the next chapter of her Transfiguration book, comfortable in the knowledge that some stories had exactly the endings they were meant to have. Sometimes the greatest magic was simply ensuring